Every book of the Old Testament explained. Genesis. In the beginning, when darkness covered the earth, God spoke, and his word set the universe ablaze. From the breath of God came stars, mountains, rivers, and life itself. But in this perfect creation, something was broken, and so began the great story of redemption. Humanity, though created in God's image, fell into rebellion. Yet even in the face of sin, God's promise of restoration echoed through the ages. From the first man to the chosen one, Abraham, God set a plan in motion to redeem the world. The flood could not drown it. The Tower of Babel could not thwart it. And the betrayal of Joseph's brothers only hastened it forward. Genesis is not just a book of beginnings. It's the genesis of God's unbreakable promise, a promise that stretches from Eden's loss to Egypt's rise and will echo into eternity. Genesis is the foundation of all things, the blueprint of the universe, and the key to understanding God's unfolding plan for humanity. It begins in a place of formless void, where silence reigns and nothing yet exists, until God speaks. His words ignite creation, bringing order to chaos, light to darkness, and life to the barren earth. This is where time begins, where the story of humanity takes shape. From the beauty of Eden to the catastrophic flood, Genesis is the epic journey of humanity's relationship with God, a journey that takes unexpected twists and turns, from innocence to rebellion, from fall to redemption. It's a story of promise, of covenant, of one man's faith that would birth a nation destined to be God's people. But it's not just the grand sweep of history that Genesis captures. It's the deeply personal, raw moments where God engages with human hearts. It's a story about family, about brokenness and reconciliation, and ultimately about a God who never abandons his creation, no matter how far they fall. In 6 days, God shapes the universe: light, sky, land, seas, plants, stars, animals, and finally, humanity. Man and woman are created in his image, and God calls it very good. The beauty of creation reflects God's power and purpose as he sets humanity as caretakers of the earth. Yet this idyllic beginning is only the start of the drama. Adam and Eve, dwelling in the Garden of Eden, walk with God in perfect harmony until a serpent's deceit changes everything. They eat the forbidden fruit, and in a single moment, innocence is lost. Sin enters the world, and humanity is separated from God. But even in their disobedience, God does not abandon them. He promises a future Redeemer, one who will crush the head of the serpent. As generations pass, humanity spirals deeper into sin and corruption, until God, grieved by the evil of the world, decides to cleanse it with a flood. But one man, Noah, finds favor with God. In an ark built according to divine instruction, Noah and his family are spared as the waters consume the earth. The flood is a reset, a fresh beginning for mankind. But it also foreshadows the judgment and mercy that will define God's dealings with humanity. Mankind, in its pride, decides to build a tower that reaches the heavens, seeking to make a name for themselves and challenge the divine order. But God confounds their language, scattering them across the earth. This moment of divine intervention is a reminder that human ambition cannot surpass the sovereignty of God. From a pagan land, God calls one man, Abram, and makes an audacious promise that he will become the father of a great nation, one through whom all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abram, renamed Abraham, journeys through the land of Canaan, learning what it means to trust God in the face of impossibilities, whether it's leaving his homeland with no clear destination or believing for a son when his wife Sarah is barren. In Abraham, we see the birth of faith, a faith that transcends circumstances and leads to the creation of the Israelite nation. The covenant God makes with Abraham becomes the bedrock of all future promises and the foundation of the messianic hope. Isaac, the son of promise, carries forward God's covenant with Abraham. His life is one of quiet obedience, a contrast to the struggles that surround him. But it is Isaac's son, Jacob, who takes center stage in the next generation. A man of ambition and cunning, Jacob wrestles both with men and with God, earning the name Israel, meaning he struggles with God. Jacob's 12 sons become the heads of the tribes of Israel, laying the groundwork for the nation that will emerge from his lineage. The story of Joseph is one of betrayal, suffering, and ultimately divine providence. Sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, Joseph rises from the pit to the palace in Egypt, becoming second in command to Pharaoh. Through a series of dreams and events, Joseph preserves his family from a devastating famine and reconciles with the very brothers who betrayed him. Joseph's story is not just one of personal triumph. It foreshadows the greater redemption that will come through the nation of Israel and, ultimately, through Jesus. What Joseph says to his brothers, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good," becomes a theme that reverberates throughout the rest of Scripture. The book of Genesis is far more than a historical account. It is a narrative of divine purpose, showing us that despite humanity's constant failures, God's faithfulness endures. Through the lives of Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Joseph, we see that the Creator is also the Redeemer, always moving towards restoration. The journey begins here with creation and covenant, and will lead all the way to the cross. Genesis invites us into the grand sweep of God's plan, leaving us with a deep anticipation for what comes next. A God who is always working, always calling, and always redeeming. The Book of Exodus. What happens when an empire refuses to bend to God's will? Egypt learned the hard way. As the plagues fell and the Red Sea split in two, the world witnessed the raw power of a God who would not be denied. But the road to freedom isn't just about escaping chains. It's about learning to walk with the God who breaks them. The journey of Exodus is not just one of deliverance. It is a call to trust, to covenant, and to a new way of life under the care of the Almighty. At the close of Genesis, we leave the story of Joseph, who, through God's providence, rose from the depths of betrayal to the heights of power in Egypt. Through Joseph, his family, the descendants of Abraham, found refuge in the land of Egypt during a time of famine. But as Genesis draws to a close, a new chapter is about to begin, one that will challenge the faith of God's people in unimaginable ways. The Israelites multiplied in Egypt, but as a new Pharaoh rises, one who knows nothing of Joseph, the very place of refuge becomes a house of bondage. What began as a sanctuary becomes a prison, and the stage is set for one of the greatest acts of deliverance in history. Exodus is the story of a people who, after centuries of slavery, cry out for deliverance. It is the story of God hearing that cry and responding with power. The journey is not just from physical slavery to freedom, but from spiritual blindness to a covenant relationship with the living God. It is a story of confrontation between a ruthless empire and the God of the universe, between the doubts of a people long held in chains and the promises of a God who never forgets. At the center of this drama is Moses, a reluctant leader raised in Pharaoh's court, but destined for a far greater calling. Exodus unfolds with epic moments of divine intervention, from plagues that shake the foundations of Egypt to miracles that forge the identity of Israel. The giving of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai marks the covenant that will shape the people of Israel for generations. But more than anything, Exodus reveals a God who is not distant, a God who enters into the suffering of his people and leads them out of Egypt, out of slavery, out of fear, and into a new life, bound by faith and law. As Pharaoh's oppression of the Israelites grows more brutal, He orders the killing of all newborn Hebrew boys. But in the midst of this darkness, a child is born, Moses, who will become the deliverer of Israel. Hidden in a basket and placed on the Nile, Moses is found and raised by Pharaoh's own daughter. Yet despite his royal upbringing, Moses cannot ignore his Hebrew roots. After fleeing Egypt for killing an Egyptian taskmaster, Moses encounters God in the form of a burning bush in the wilderness. It is here that God calls Moses to return to Egypt, not as a prince, but as a prophet, to lead his people to freedom. The bush burns but is not consumed, symbolizing the unquenchable power of God's presence. God's message is clear: I have seen the misery of my people. I have come down to rescue them. When Moses returns to Egypt with his brother Aaron, they stand before Pharaoh with a simple command from God: let my people go. But Pharaoh, seeing himself as a god, refuses to yield to the demands of the Lord. And so begins a series of divine judgments, the 10 plagues, that will reveal the impotence of Egypt's gods and the supreme authority of Yahweh. The water of the Nile turns to blood. Frogs, gnats, and flies swarm the land. Livestock dies and boils afflict the Egyptians. Hail and locusts destroy crops. Darkness covers the land for 3 days. With each plague, the tension between Pharaoh's hard heart and God's power intensifies. Yet the final plague is the most devastating: the death of the firstborn throughout Egypt. In the midst of this plague, God instructs the Israelites to mark their doors with the blood of a lamb. The angel of death passes over these homes, sparing those who are covered by the blood. This Passover event becomes the defining moment in Israel's history, symbolizing both their physical deliverance and the future redemption through the blood of a greater lamb. After the final plague breaks Pharaoh's will, he releases the Israelites. They leave Egypt in haste, their journey towards freedom finally beginning. But Pharaoh's regret is swift, and he sends his armies to pursue the fleeing Israelites, trapping them between the Red Sea and the advancing Egyptian chariots. The people panic, questioning why they were brought out of Egypt to die in the wilderness. But Moses, filled with faith, stretches out his hand over the sea, and God performs one of the most dramatic miracles in the Bible: the parting of the Red Sea. The waters stand as walls on either side, and the Israelites pass through on dry ground. When the Egyptian army follows, the waters collapse, drowning Pharaoh's forces and securing Israel's escape. This moment is the climax of God's deliverance, a defining miracle that cements his identity as the Redeemer of his people. As the Israelites journey through the wilderness, their faith is tested. Faced with hunger and thirst, they grumble and question God's care. Yet, God provides for them in miraculous ways: manna, the bread from heaven, and water flowing from a rock. Despite their doubts, God's provision is constant, teaching them to rely on him daily for their survival. But this wilderness journey is not just about physical sustenance. It is about learning to trust God, to depend on his word and his promises, even when the future seems uncertain. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the Israelites arrive at Mount Sinai. Here, amidst thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud of smoke, God descends on the mountain to establish his covenant with his people. This is not just a moment of law-giving, it is the birth of a nation under God's rule. The 10 Commandments are given, moral laws that will shape Israel's identity and set them apart as God's holy nation. The commandments reveal the heart of God's desire for his people: to love him with all their heart, and to love their neighbor as themselves. These laws form the backbone of Israel's relationship with God, and the people respond with awe, agreeing to follow this covenant. But even as Moses communes with God on the mountain, the Israelites grow impatient and turn to idolatry. They build a golden calf, a direct violation of the covenant they just agreed to. In this moment, the fragility of human faithfulness is exposed. Yet, God's response is both just and merciful. While judgment comes upon those who lead the rebellion, God, through Moses' intercession, renews his covenant and continues his journey with his people. The final chapters of Exodus describe the construction of the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary where God's presence will dwell among his people. This is more than a structure. It is a symbol of God's desire to be with his people, to guide them, and to make his glory known. The tabernacle foreshadows the ultimate dwelling of God among humanity, pointing forward to the coming of Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh who tabernacles among us. Exodus is not merely a story of escape. It is the blueprint for understanding God's heart for his people. It is about liberation, not just from physical slavery, but from the bondage of fear, doubt, and idolatry. Through the figure of Moses, God raises a deliverer, but it is God himself who leads, provides, and sustains his people. The journey from slavery to freedom is not a smooth one. The Israelites' faith wavers, their hearts often turn back to Egypt, and yet God remains steadfast. His covenant with them at Sinai sets the stage for the rest of the Old Testament, defining the relationship between God and his chosen people. And through every twist and turn, Exodus points to a greater deliverance yet to come, the ultimate redemption through Jesus, the true Passover Lamb. In Exodus, we see that God is not only the creator of the world, but the redeemer of his people. His power is unmatched, his justice is righteous, and his mercy is boundless. The road to freedom is paved with faith, and God's guiding hand leads the way. The Book of Leviticus. Holiness wasn't an option, it was a necessity. God laid down the framework for his people to be different. In a world filled with idolatry, impurity, and rebellion, Israel was called to stand out, not because of their power or their wisdom, but because of their relationship with a holy God. To live in his presence, to be his people, meant more than just keeping laws. It meant reflecting his very nature. At the close of Exodus, we leave the Israelites at the foot of Mount Sinai. God has delivered them from Egypt with mighty acts of judgment, led them through the wilderness, and entered into a covenant with them, giving them the 10 Commandments and detailed instructions for building the tabernacle, a place where his presence would dwell among them. But now, as they stand on the edge of a new chapter, a question arises. How can a holy God dwell among a sinful people? This is where Leviticus comes in. It answers the question of how a redeemed people are to live in the presence of a holy God. It's not enough that they've been freed from slavery. Now they must learn to walk in holiness. Leviticus is God's instruction manual for a nation that is called to be different, set apart from the nations around them as his holy people. In Exodus, we see God rescue his people. In Leviticus, we see him refine them. Leviticus is about holiness, a concept that goes far beyond mere moral purity. To be holy means to be set apart, to be dedicated for God's purpose. The Israelites are called to be a holy nation because their God is holy. But what does that look like? Leviticus lays out the blueprint for a life of holiness, detailing everything from the proper way to offer sacrifices to laws about purity, justice, and personal conduct. It shows that worship is not just a ritual to be performed in the tabernacle, but a way of life. At its core, Leviticus teaches that holiness wasn't optional for Israel, it was essential. The people of God were called to reflect his character, and that meant living by his standards. Through the sacrifices, priesthood, and laws, Leviticus provides the structure for a people who must learn how to live in God's holy presence without being consumed by it. It's about bridging the gap between a perfect, righteous God and imperfect, sinful humanity. The first 7 chapters of Leviticus detail the various offerings that the Israelites were to bring to God. These include the burnt offering, grain offering, peace offering, sin offering, and guilt offering. Each of these sacrifices served a specific purpose, either to atone for sin, express gratitude, or restore fellowship with God. The sacrificial system emphasizes that sin is costly. It requires the shedding of blood. But it also shows God's provision for reconciliation. The sacrifices, though temporary, foreshadow the ultimate sacrifice that will be made by Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. In Leviticus, we see the beginnings of a divine pattern. Sin leads to death, but God offers a way for His people to be restored to life and fellowship with Him. A significant part of Leviticus is dedicated to the establishment of the priesthood, specifically the family of Aaron. The priests were responsible for offering the sacrifices and maintaining the purity of the tabernacle. They acted as mediators between God and the people, standing in the gap to ensure that the people's relationship with God remained intact. The ordination of Aaron and his sons is a solemn and sacred event. Their role was critical because they represented the people before God, but even they had to approach God with caution. When Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, they were struck down as a warning that even those who serve as mediators must approach God's holiness with reverence and obedience. One of the most important events in Leviticus is the Day of Atonement, described in chapter 16. This was a solemn annual event where the high priest, and only the high priest, would enter the Holy of Holies, the innermost part of the tabernacle, where God's presence dwelled. On this day, the sins of the entire nation would be symbolically placed on a scapegoat, which would be sent into the wilderness, while another goat was sacrificed to atone for the people's sins. The Day of Atonement was the climax of the sacrificial system. It was a vivid demonstration of the seriousness of sin and the lengths to which God would go to purify His people. It also pointed to a future atonement, one that would not need to be repeated year after year, but would be accomplished once and for all through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Leviticus goes into great detail about what is considered clean and unclean, covering everything from dietary laws to regulations on skin diseases and bodily discharges. These laws may seem strange or even archaic to modern readers, but they served a purpose in setting Israel apart from other nations. Purity laws reminded the Israelites of their unique calling. They were not to live like the surrounding nations. Even in their everyday lives, what they ate, how they handled sickness, and how they worshipped, they were to reflect God's holiness. These laws also taught the people that nothing impure could come into contact with the holiness of God without being made clean. The distinction between clean and unclean also serves as a metaphor for sin and righteousness. Just as touching something unclean made a person ceremonially unclean, so sin defiles the soul. But God, in His mercy, provides a way to cleanse both. Leviticus also contains a wealth of moral and social laws that govern how the Israelites were to interact with each other. These include laws about justice, fairness, sexual purity, and care for the poor and the foreigner. One of the most famous commands from Leviticus is, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," Leviticus 19:18. These laws show that holiness wasn't just about rituals and sacrifices. It was about how the Israelites were to live every day. God's people were called to live lives marked by integrity, compassion, and justice. Holiness was meant to be lived out in relationships, in the marketplace, in the courts, and in the home. Throughout the book of Leviticus, one phrase is repeated over and over, "Be holy, for I am holy." This is the heartbeat of the entire book. Holiness is not just about following rules, it's about reflecting God's character. The Israelites were to be a living testimony to the nations around them, showing the world what it looked like to live in relationship with a holy and just God. God's laws in Leviticus were not arbitrary. They were meant to reflect His nature, His justice, mercy, righteousness, and purity. The people of Israel were called to embody these qualities, and through them, God's holiness was to be made known to the world. Leviticus may seem, at first glance, like a dense book of rules and regulations, but it is so much more. It's a guidebook for holy living, a divine manual for how a people set apart for God are to live in a world filled with unholiness. Every law, every sacrifice, and every ritual points to the deep truth that God desires to dwell among His people, but He cannot do so without holiness. Leviticus also looks forward, anticipating the perfect sacrifice, the ultimate high priest, and the day when God's people will not just be ceremonially clean, but truly holy, through the cleansing work of Jesus Christ. It reminds us that holiness is not about outward conformity, but about an inward transformation that reflects the character of a holy God. In the wilderness, Leviticus gave Israel the roadmap to become God's holy nation. For us today, it reminds us that to follow God means to live differently, set apart, purified by His grace, and reflecting His holiness to a watching world. The Book of Numbers. The wilderness is where faith is tested. Will the people of God trust Him, or will they crumble under the weight of their doubts? In the barren wilderness, far from the comforts of Egypt and the promises of Canaan, every step becomes a question of faith. Will the people remember the God who parted the Red Sea, or will they give in to fear and rebellion? Numbers is the story of a people caught between the God who delivers and the doubts that linger. As the book of Leviticus concludes, the Israelites have been given the laws and instructions to live as a holy people in covenant with God. They are camped at the base of Mount Sinai, preparing for the journey to the Promised Land. Leviticus showed them how to live in the presence of a holy God. Now, in Numbers, they must learn how to walk in faith as they journey toward their inheritance. But this journey will not be easy. The wilderness, a place of testing, lies ahead. Will they trust God, or will their hearts waver under the weight of doubt, fear, and rebellion? Numbers is a tale of two generations, the one that left Egypt in hope but was destined to die in the wilderness, and the one that would rise up to enter the Promised Land. The book recounts the ups and downs of Israel's journey through the wilderness, where faith is tested and failure often follows. Though God had delivered them miraculously from Egypt, the Israelites struggle to trust Him fully. As a result, their journey, which should have taken weeks, stretches into 40 years of wandering in a barren land. Yet, even in their failure, God remains faithful. He guides them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He provides manna from heaven and water from the rock. Numbers is a story of divine patience and persistence as God works to shape His people into a nation ready to receive His promises. It's a reminder that faith is not tested in comfort, but in the wilderness, where every step forward requires trust in the unseen. At the very beginning of Numbers, God instructs Moses to take a census of all the men in Israel who are able to go to war. This count is not just a matter of logistics. It's a symbolic moment that underscores the beginning of a new phase for Israel. They are no longer a wandering group of former slaves. They are being transformed into a nation with an army, ready to take possession of the land God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The census reveals the strength of the people, but it also foreshadows the coming trials. Despite their numbers, it is not their military might that will determine their success, but their faith in God's promise. As the Israelites approach the borders of the Promised Land, Moses sends 12 spies to scout out the land of Canaan. For 40 days, these spies explore the land, witnessing its abundance and potential. When they return, they bring back a mixed report. Yes, the land flows with milk and honey, just as God had said. But the people who live there are giants, and their cities are fortified. 10 of the spies spread fear among the people, insisting that conquering the land is impossible. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, stand firm in their faith, urging the Israelites to trust in God's power to deliver the land into their hands. But fear takes hold, and the people rebel. They cry out, wishing they could return to Egypt, doubting God's promise. This moment marks a pivotal turning point in the book of Numbers. Because of their unbelief, God declares that the entire generation, except Joshua and Caleb, will not enter the Promised Land. Instead, They will wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies spent scouting the land, until that generation dies off. The promised land is delayed not because of God's inability, but because of the people's lack of faith. As the Israelites wander through the wilderness, unrest begins to brew. One of the most significant challenges to Moses' leadership comes from Korah, a Levite, who, along with others, accuses Moses and Aaron of elevating themselves above the rest of the people. Korah questions the authority God has given them and seeks to overthrow their leadership. But this rebellion isn't just a challenge to Moses and Aaron, it's a direct challenge to God's appointed order. In response, God acts decisively. The ground opens up and swallows Korah and his followers, sending a clear message that God is the one who establishes authority, and rebellion against his chosen leaders is rebellion against him. The rebellion of Korah serves as a sobering reminder that even in the wilderness, where God's presence is visible and his provision constant, pride and ambition can lead to destruction. It's a call to humility and obedience for the people of God. As the years of wandering drag on, the Israelites grow increasingly impatient. They complain once again about the lack of food and water, questioning why they ever left Egypt. Their ingratitude and unbelief provoke God's judgment, and he sends venomous serpents among them. Many are bitten, and the people cry out for mercy. In response, God instructs Moses to make a bronze serpent and lift it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at the bronze serpent and be healed. This strange event is not just an act of physical healing, it's a profound symbol of salvation. The bronze serpent foreshadows the coming of Christ, who would later say, "Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him." John 3, verses 14 to 15. The lesson of the bronze serpent is clear. Even in judgment, God provides a way of salvation. But that salvation requires faith. Faith to look up and believe that healing will come. Toward the end of the wilderness journey, the people once again find themselves without water, and they begin to grumble against Moses and Aaron. God instructs Moses to speak to a rock, and water will miraculously flow from it. But in a moment of frustration, Moses strikes the rock twice instead of speaking to it, disobeying God's command. Though water does flow from the rock, Moses' disobedience has consequences. God tells him that because he did not trust in him enough to honor him before the people, Moses will not enter the promised land. This moment marks a tragic turning point for Moses, the faithful leader who has brought the people so far, but who will not see the final fulfillment of God's promise. It's a stark reminder that even the most faithful leaders are not immune to failure, and that disobedience, even in small moments, can have lasting consequences. As Israel approaches the borders of Canaan, a foreign king, Balak, seeks to curse the Israelites by hiring a pagan prophet named Balaam. Balak wants Balaam to speak curses over God's people to weaken them before battle. But every time Balaam tries to curse Israel, God intervenes, turning the curses into blessings. In one of the most unusual stories in the Bible, Balaam's donkey speaks to him, warning him of an angel blocking his path. This event underscores God's absolute sovereignty. He can use even a donkey to speak his truth. Despite Balaam's intentions, God remains in control, and his promises to Israel cannot be thwarted. Numbers is not just a historical account of Israel's time in the wilderness. It is a profound spiritual journey. It reveals the fragility of human faith, the persistence of doubt, and the consequences of disobedience. But it also showcases God's unwavering faithfulness. Even when the people fail, God remains present, guiding them, providing for them, and moving his plan forward. Through census counts, rebellions, miracles, and judgments, Numbers teaches us that the wilderness is not a place to be feared, but a place of transformation. It's where God shapes his people, refining their faith and preparing them for the promises ahead. It reminds us that even in our moments of failure, God's mercy is greater than our mistakes, and His plans for us cannot be undone by human weakness. In the end, a new generation arises, one that will enter the promised land. But before they do, they must learn what their parents struggled to grasp. The wilderness is where faith is forged, and only by trusting God can they walk into the future He has promised. The Book of Deuteronomy. At the edge of the promised land, one man's voice echoed like thunder, urging a new generation to remember their God. They stood on the cusp of fulfillment, a land flowing with milk and honey just within reach. But before they could take that step, they had to hear one last message, a reminder that the true battle wasn't against the giants in Canaan, but against the temptations of their own hearts. Would they trust in the God who delivered them, or forget Him in the days of prosperity? After 40 long years of wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites stand on the brink of the promised land. The previous generation, marked by doubt and rebellion, has passed away, and a new generation has risen. They have experienced God's provision. They've seen the failures of their parents, and now they are ready to cross the Jordan River into the land promised to their ancestors. But before they take that decisive step, their leader, Moses, stands before them one last time. He knows that he will not enter the promised land with them. Instead, he gives them a final, powerful address, a sermon that will define their identity and future. This is the book of Deuteronomy, a reflection on the past and a charge for the future. Deuteronomy is Moses' farewell message to the people he has led for decades. It is a book filled with urgency, as Moses passionately pleads with the Israelites to remember the lessons of their past and to hold fast to the covenant with God as they step into a new chapter of their history. Moses knows that the greatest threat to Israel is not the enemies they will face in Canaan, but the danger of forgetting their God once they settle into prosperity and comfort. This book is a reflection on the law, a retelling of Israel's journey, and a reminder of the covenant that binds them to God. Moses reiterates the 10 Commandments and expands on what it means to live as God's chosen people. He urges the Israelites to choose life by loving God, obeying His commands, and walking in His ways. Deuteronomy is more than a list of laws. It's a heartfelt plea from a leader who knows that the future of his people depends on their faithfulness to God. At the beginning of Deuteronomy, Moses recaps Israel's journey from Egypt to the plains of Moab, where they now stand. He recounts the miraculous deliverance from Pharaoh's oppression, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and the years of wandering in the wilderness. This is not merely a history lesson. It is a reminder of God's faithfulness and the consequences of disobedience. Moses emphasizes how God sustained them in the wilderness, providing manna from heaven and water from the rock. He also reminds them of the tragic moments when their ancestors failed to trust God, especially the moment when they refused to enter the promised land because of fear, resulting in 40 years of wandering. This retelling serves as a sobering warning to the new generation. Do not repeat the mistakes of the past. At the heart of Moses' final sermon is the reiteration of the 10 Commandments, which had been given to the people at Mount Sinai. These commandments are the foundation of Israel's covenant with God, outlining the moral and spiritual framework for their lives. Moses emphasizes the importance of these laws, reminding the people that obedience is not just about following rules. It's about maintaining their relationship with the God who rescued them from slavery. As Moses speaks, he urges the people to understand the heart behind the commandments: love for God and love for one another. The laws are meant to reflect the character of God and set Israel apart as a holy nation, different from the pagan cultures around them. One of the most significant moments in Deuteronomy is when Moses gives the Shema, a prayer and declaration of Israel's faith that would become central to Jewish life. In Deuteronomy 6:4-5, Moses declares, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." This is more than a command. It is the essence of the covenant. Moses is telling the people that their success in the promised land will not be determined by military strength or political strategy, but by their wholehearted devotion to God. The Shema becomes a daily reminder of who they are and who God is, and it calls them to love God above all else. As Moses continues his speech, he lays out the blessings that will come if the Israelites remain faithful to God, as well as the curses that will follow if they turn away. These chapters emphasize the conditional nature of the covenant. Obedience will lead to prosperity, peace, and God's continued presence in the land, while disobedience will bring suffering, defeat, and eventually exile. The blessings include abundant harvests, protection from enemies, and the fulfillment of God's promises. But the curses are severe: famine, disease, defeat in battle, and ultimately being scattered among the nations. Moses makes it clear that the stakes are high. Faithfulness to God is a matter of life and death. In one of the most moving moments of the book, Moses gives the people a choice. "This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live." Deuteronomy 30, verse 19. Moses' final charge is a passionate plea for the Israelites to choose life by loving God and walking in His ways. He knows that their future depends on this choice. To choose life is to embrace the covenant, to live in relationship with God, and to follow His commands. To choose death is to turn away, to forget God, and to embrace the ways of the surrounding nations. Moses knows that the lure of idolatry will be strong, but he implores the people to remain faithful. After delivering his final sermon, Moses ascends Mount Nebo, where God allows him to see the promised land from a distance. Though Moses will not enter the land because of his earlier disobedience, he is given the honor of seeing the fulfillment of God's promise. From this vantage point, Moses surveys the land that his people will soon inherit. Moses dies on the mountain, and the Bible tells us that God Himself buries him. His leadership ends, but his legacy continues through Joshua, the man chosen to lead Israel into the promised land. The people mourn Moses for 30 days, recognizing that there has never been another prophet like him, one who spoke with God face to face. Deuteronomy is Moses' final sermon, but it is much more than that. It is a book of covenant renewal, a passionate plea from a leader who has walked with his people through the highs and lows of their journey. It's a call to faithfulness, a warning against complacency, and an invitation to choose life by loving and obeying God. Moses knows that the future of Israel is not guaranteed by military strength or political alliances, but by their relationship with God. He urges them to remember their history, to remember the God who delivered them from Egypt, and to hold fast to the covenant as they move forward into the promised land. Deuteronomy is both a reflection on the past and a vision for the future. It's about covenant, law, and love, an enduring call for God's people to live in faithfulness, so that they may experience the fullness of His blessings. Moses may not enter the promised land, but through his words, he prepares Israel to inherit it, reminding them that their true success depends not on their strength, but on their faith in the God who brought them this far. The Book of Joshua. The walls of Jericho fell not by human strength, but by the mighty hand of God, proving that no fortress can stand against His will. But as the Israelites marched forward, they would soon learn that the greatest battles were not fought with swords or spears, but with obedience and faith. Would they trust in the God who had delivered them, or would they falter in the face of temptation and fear? Moses, the great leader and prophet, is gone, but God's promises to Israel remain. As the book of Joshua begins, the Israelites stand at the threshold of the promised land, waiting for the fulfillment of the covenant made with Abraham centuries before. The leadership baton has been passed from Moses to Joshua, a man who has been trained for this moment. Israel's military commander and servant of the Lord. Where Deuteronomy was a call to obedience and covenant faithfulness, Joshua is a book of action and conquest. It's the story of a people stepping into the promise, led by a leader whose faith in God will determine the fate of the nation. Joshua is a story of conquest, but it is also a story of faith and reliance on God's power. The Israelites are not a mighty nation with advanced weapons or experienced armies. Instead, they are a people whose strength lies in their obedience to God and their trust in His promises. The conquest of Canaan is not just a military campaign, it is a divine mission where every victory is credited to God's intervention, and every failure is the result of disobedience. As they enter the land, the Israelites face fortified cities, giants, and hostile nations, but Joshua knows that the real battle is a spiritual one. The key to victory is not in military strategy, but in faithfulness to God's commands. The book of Joshua is filled with moments of triumph, miraculous interventions, and reminders that God is always faithful to His word. The first major event in Joshua's leadership is the crossing of the Jordan River. Just as God parted the Red Sea for Moses and the previous generation, He now parts the Jordan River for Joshua and the new generation of Israelites. As the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant step into the river, the waters miraculously stop, allowing the people to cross on dry ground. This moment is significant not only because it mirrors the crossing of the Red Sea, but also because it marks the official beginning of Israel's conquest of the Promised Land. The Ark of the Covenant, which represents God's presence, leads the way, symbolizing that it is God who is going before them into battle. Once across, Joshua sets up 12 stones as a memorial to remind future generations of God's power and faithfulness. One of the most famous events in the book of Joshua is the Battle of Jericho, a heavily fortified city standing as the first obstacle in Israel's conquest of Canaan. But instead of using conventional military tactics, God gives Joshua a seemingly strange command. March around the city once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, march around it 7 times. After the 7th circuit, the priests are to blow their trumpets, and the people are to shout. Despite the oddity of the plan, Joshua and the Israelites obey without question. On the 7th day, as they shout, the mighty walls of Jericho collapse. The city is taken, and the Israelites experience their first victory in the Promised Land. This event proves that their success will not come by human strength or clever strategies, but by faith in God's power. Jericho's fall is a testimony to the truth that no fortress, no matter how strong, can stand against the will of God. In the aftermath of the victory at Jericho, not all is well. God had commanded that all the spoils of Jericho were to be devoted to Him and not taken by the people. However, one man, Achan, disobeys and secretly keeps some of the treasures for himself. As a result, when the Israelites go to fight the small city of Ai, they are unexpectedly defeated. Joshua is devastated and seeks the Lord, only to discover that sin within the camp has caused God to withdraw His favor. Achan's sin is uncovered, and he and his family face severe judgment. This event serves as a sobering reminder that disobedience, even in secret, can have far-reaching consequences. It also highlights the seriousness with which God views holiness and obedience in the conquest of the land. After dealing with Achan's sin, God gives Joshua instructions for a second attempt to take Ai. This time, the Israelites succeed, using a clever strategy to draw out the enemy and ambush them. The victory at Ai shows that failure, though painful, is not the end. When sin is dealt with and the people return to God's ways, He grants them success. The lesson of Ai is that God's favor is tied to the people's faithfulness. They cannot rely on their own strength or military prowess. They must remain wholly dependent on God. One of the most extraordinary events in Joshua's campaign is the battle against 5 Amorite kings who unite against Israel. As the battle rages, Joshua prays for the sun to stand still, giving the Israelites more time to achieve victory. In response to Joshua's prayer, God causes the sun to stop in the sky, extending the day and allowing the Israelites to defeat their enemies. This miraculous event demonstrates the extent of God's involvement in Israel's conquest. It's not just about armies and battles. God is actively working in the natural world to ensure his people's victory. The event also highlights the power of prayer and the partnership between God's sovereignty and human action. After the major battles are won, the land of Canaan is divided among the 12 tribes of Israel. This distribution of land fulfills the promises made to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that their descendants would inherit the land. Each tribe receives a portion of the land, and cities of refuge are established for those who accidentally cause death. The division of the land is not just about geography, it's about inheritance, identity, and belonging. Each tribe's portion is a tangible reminder of God's faithfulness to fulfill his promises. However, the Israelites must continue to drive out the remaining Canaanites and fully possess their inheritance, which will prove to be a challenge in the years to come. As Joshua nears the end of his life, he calls the people together for one final address, much like Moses did before him. Joshua reminds them of all that God has done for them, from their deliverance from Egypt to their victories in Canaan. He calls them to remain faithful to the Lord and warns them of the dangers of turning to the gods of the surrounding nations. In one of the most famous verses in the Bible, Joshua declares, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Joshua 24:15. The people respond by renewing their covenant with God, pledging to serve him alone. Joshua's farewell speech is a reminder that the conquest of the land is not the end of Israel's story. It is the beginning. The real challenge lies ahead. Will they remain faithful to the God who has given them the land? Joshua is a book of conquest, but more importantly, it is a book of faith. It shows that God's promises are sure, but his people must trust him and obey his commands to fully experience the blessings he offers. The victories in Canaan were not won by Israel's might, but by God's power and their willingness to follow him. However, the book of Joshua also serves as a warning. While the land is conquered and the people settle, the seeds of future struggles are sown. The Canaanites are not fully driven out, and the people's faithfulness will be tested in the years to come. Joshua's final charge to the people, to choose whom they will serve, reminds us that the true battle is always for the heart. In every generation, the people of God must decide whether they will walk in obedience to him or turn aside to other gods. Joshua's leadership marks the beginning of Israel's life in the Promised Land, but it also sets the stage for the challenges that will follow. It is a story of faith, failure, and, ultimately, the unwavering faithfulness of God, who is always ready to fight for his people when they place their trust in him. The Book of Judges. When there is no king, the people do what is right in their own eyes. Chaos reigns, but God's mercy breaks through in unexpected ways. In the darkest moments of Israel's history, when sin and rebellion seem to overwhelm, God raises up unlikely heroes, flawed men and women who deliver his people, reminding them that even in the chaos, God has not abandoned them. The book of Joshua ends on a high note. The Israelites have entered the Promised Land, conquered their enemies, and settled into their allotted territories. Joshua's leadership brought order, obedience, and victory, but his final charge to the people foreshadowed the troubles that lay ahead. "Choose this day whom you will serve," Joshua had warned. For a time, the people followed the Lord, but after Joshua's death, the nation slowly begins to unravel. In the book of Judges, Israel enters a dark and chaotic period. Without a strong leader like Joshua, the tribes fail to complete the conquest of the land, and they fall into a repetitive cycle of sin and disobedience. The Canaanite influences and pagan practices that Israel was supposed to drive out begin to corrupt the nation from within. It's a time marked by moral and spiritual decay, but it is also a time when God raises up unlikely heroes to deliver his people, revealing his persistent mercy in the midst of their rebellion. Judges is a story of spiritual and moral decline. The book's central theme is summarized by one recurring line. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Judges 21:25. With no central authority and no consistent leader, Israel falls into a tragic pattern of sin, suffering the consequences of their rebellion, crying out to God for help, and then being delivered by judges, leaders raised up by God to rescue them from their oppressors. This cycle repeats itself over and over, each time with deeper levels of depravity and chaos. The judges themselves are often deeply flawed characters, showing that even those chosen by God can be corrupted by the culture around them. Yet despite Israel's repeated failures, God's mercy endures. Time and again, he hears their cries and raises up deliverers, demonstrating his relentless commitment to his covenant people. The book of Judges opens with a bleak assessment of Israel's state. After Joshua's death, the tribes of Israel fail to fully drive out the Canaanites from the land, and over time, they begin to adopt the practices and gods of the surrounding nations. The people turn away from the Lord, worshipping Baal and Asherah, and as a result, they are oppressed by their enemies. One of the most notable figures in the book of Judges is Deborah, a prophetess and the only female judge mentioned in the Bible. At a time when Israel is oppressed by Jabin, king of Canaan, and his commander Sisera, Deborah rises to leadership. She calls Barak, a military leader, to lead the charge against Sisera's army, but Barak hesitates, insisting that Deborah go with him. Deborah agrees, but she prophesies that the glory of the victory will not go to Barak, but to a woman. This prophecy is fulfilled in the most unexpected way. After Sisera's army is defeated, he flees and seeks refuge in the tent of a woman named Jael. While he sleeps, Jael drives a tent peg through his head, delivering the final blow to Israel's enemy. Deborah's story demonstrates that in a time of chaos, God can use anyone, men or women, soldiers or civilians, to bring about his deliverance. Gideon is another unlikely hero in the book of Judges. When we first meet him, he is hiding in a winepress, threshing wheat in fear of the Midianites, who are oppressing Israel. Yet God chooses this timid man to lead Israel's army. Gideon's story is one of doubt, weakness, and the surprising ways in which God works. Before agreeing to lead, Gideon famously asks for a sign from God, the fleece test, twice, revealing his hesitance and uncertainty. But once Gideon accepts his calling, God makes it clear that the victory will come by his power alone. Gideon assembles an army, but God reduces the number of soldiers to just 300 men, ensuring that Israel cannot boast in their own strength. With this small, seemingly insignificant force, Gideon defeats the vast Midianite army, showing that God's power is made perfect in weakness. However, like many of the judges, Gideon's story does not end on a high note. After his victory, he creates an ephod, which becomes an object of idolatry for the people, and his family is later embroiled in violence. His life reflects the tragic complexity of the judges, heroes raised up by God, yet flawed and often contributing to the chaos they were meant to overcome. Jephthah is another judge who delivers Israel from oppression, but his story is marked by a tragic vow. Jephthah is an outcast, the son of a prostitute. But when Israel is oppressed by the Ammonites, the elders of Gilead turn to him for help. Jephthah leads Israel to victory, but before the battle, he makes a rash vow to God, promising that if God grants him success, he will sacrifice whatever comes out of the door of his house to greet him upon his return. Tragically, when Jephthah returns home, it is his daughter, his only child, who comes out to greet him. Bound by his vow, Jephthah follows through with the sacrifice. This story highlights the dangers of making impulsive promises to God and serves as a reminder of the devastating consequences of human folly and misunderstanding of God's character. Samson is perhaps the most famous of the judges, known for his incredible physical strength and his tragic downfall. His birth is foretold by an angel, and from birth, Samson is set apart as a Nazirite, dedicated to God. His strength is legendary, allowing him to single-handedly defeat the Philistines, who are Israel's oppressors during his time. However, Samson's life is marked by impulsiveness and moral weakness. He often acts out of personal vengeance rather than a desire to deliver Israel, and his downfall comes at the hands of Delilah, a Philistine woman who betrays him by cutting his hair, the source of his strength. Blinded and imprisoned by the Philistines, Samson's story seems to end in defeat. But in his final moments, Samson prays to God for one last act of strength, and he brings down the temple of Dagon, killing himself and many Philistines in the process. Samson's life embodies the chaos of the time, immense potential and strength, yet squandered by personal flaws and disobedience. His story is a reflection of Israel's own condition, blessed by God, but continually weakened by sin and compromise. The final chapters of Judges depict the nation of Israel descending into near-total anarchy. One of the most disturbing stories in the Bible occurs when a Levite's concubine is brutally abused and killed, leading to civil war between the tribe of Benjamin and the rest of Israel. The brutality and chaos of these events reflect just how far the nation has fallen from the covenant faithfulness that marked the days of Moses and Joshua. These stories highlight the complete breakdown of moral order in Israel. Without a king and without a unifying leader, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The book ends on this note of despair, setting the stage for the eventual rise of the monarchy, where Israel will long for a king to bring order and stability. The book of Judges is a story of chaos, rebellion, and failure, but it is also a story of God's enduring mercy. Despite Israel's repeated descent into sin and idolatry, God continues to respond to their cries for help. The judges, flawed as they are, become instruments of deliverance, showing that God's power can work through the most imperfect of vessels. But the story of Judges is also a sobering reminder of what happens when a people abandon God's ways. Without a king, without consistent leadership, the nation of Israel falls deeper into moral and spiritual decay. The chaos of this period sets the stage for the eventual rise of the monarchy, where Israel will long for a king to unite and lead them. However, as we will see, even the kings will struggle to provide the leadership Israel needs. Ultimately, the book of Judges leaves us longing for a perfect leader, a king who can truly bring peace and righteousness to God's people. The book of Ruth. In a world of famine and loss, a foreign woman's faith shines, leading to a legacy that would change the world. Ruth's story is one of quiet but profound redemption, a reminder that even in the darkest times, God is weaving a plan that brings hope and life to his people. From a humble field in Bethlehem to the throne of David, and ultimately to the birth of Christ, Ruth's faith and loyalty echo through the ages. The book of Judges ends in a time of darkness and chaos for Israel, a period marked by moral decline and spiritual disarray. Yet, in the midst of this turbulent era, the story of Ruth emerges, a quiet but profound narrative of loyalty, love, and redemption. While the nation of Israel is struggling with its identity and faithfulness to God, one family's personal journey reflects a greater truth. God is always at work, weaving redemption through the most unexpected of lives and circumstances. Ruth's story shines as a beacon of hope in a time when hope was hard to find. Ruth is a beautiful and intimate story that stands in stark contrast to the tumultuous events of Judges. It's not a tale of battles or kings, but of everyday people facing hardship, making choices, and experiencing the providence of God in their lives. It is a story of famine, loss, and grief, but also of remarkable faith, steadfast loyalty, and unexpected redemption. At its heart, Ruth is a love story, between Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi, between Ruth and Boaz, and ultimately between God and his people. Through the faithfulness of Ruth, a foreign woman from Moab, God's plan of redemption moves forward, culminating in the birth of King David and ultimately pointing toward Jesus, the ultimate Redeemer. The story begins with Naomi, her husband Elimelech, and their 2 sons leaving Bethlehem due to a severe famine. They journey to the foreign land of Moab, a place that had often been an enemy of Israel. In Moab, tragedy strikes. Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi a widow. Her 2 sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. But after about 10 years, both sons die as well, leaving Naomi alone with her 2 daughters-in-law. With nothing left for her in Moab, and hearing that the famine in Bethlehem has ended, Naomi decides to return to her homeland. She urges Orpah and Ruth to stay in Moab, where they have better chances of remarrying and finding security. Orpah reluctantly agrees, but Ruth refuses to leave Naomi's side. Ruth's famous declaration of loyalty is one of the most poignant moments in the Bible. She tells Naomi, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Ruth 1:16-17. Ruth's decision is not just an act of familial loyalty, it is a profound step of faith. By choosing to go with Naomi, Ruth is leaving behind her own culture, religion, and family, and embracing the God of Israel. In a world where loyalty often faltered, Ruth's steadfastness shines brightly. Ruth's devotion is a powerful example of faith and love. She is willing to sacrifice her own future for the sake of Naomi, and in doing so, she unknowingly steps into the unfolding plan of God. This act of loyalty will lead to her becoming part of the lineage of Israel's greatest king, and ultimately, the Messiah. Upon returning to Bethlehem, Ruth and Naomi find themselves in a precarious situation. As widows, they have no immediate means of support. But Ruth, ever practical and determined, goes out to glean in the fields, picking up leftover grain after the harvesters, as was allowed for the poor in Israelite law. She just happens to end up in the field of Boaz, a wealthy landowner and a relative of Naomi's late husband. Boaz takes notice of Ruth not only because of her hard work, but because of her reputation. He has heard of Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her commitment to caring for her. Boaz shows her kindness, offering protection and ensuring that she gathers plenty of grain. Ruth returns to Naomi with an abundance of food, and when Naomi learns that Boaz is involved, hope begins to stir in her heart. Boaz is not just a kind landowner. He is a kinsman redeemer, a close relative who, according to Israelite custom, has the responsibility to care for and potentially marry a widow to preserve the family line. Naomi, recognizing that Boaz could be their redeemer, instructs Ruth to approach him in a culturally significant way. Ruth goes to Boaz at night, lying at his feet as a humble request for him to fulfill his role as a kinsman redeemer. This act is both bold and deeply respectful, showing Ruth's faith in Naomi's guidance and Boaz's integrity. Boaz is moved by Ruth's proposal, recognizing her honor and kindness. However, there is a complication. Another man is a closer relative and has the first right to redeem the land and marry Ruth. Boaz handles the situation with grace and wisdom, meeting the man at the town gate, a place for legal transactions, and offering him the opportunity to redeem the land. The man declines, and Boaz joyfully steps into the role of kinsman redeemer. Boaz's willingness to redeem Ruth is a powerful symbol of God's redemptive love. Just as Boaz takes Ruth, a foreigner, into his family and restores her, so too does God take those who are outsiders and bring them into his covenant family through redemption. Boaz and Ruth marry, and their union is blessed with a son, Obed. This child is more than just a blessing to Ruth and Naomi. Obed becomes the grandfather of King David, Israel's greatest king. Through Ruth, the foreign Moabite woman, the royal line of David is established, and from this lineage, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, will one day be born. The birth of Obed restores joy and hope to Naomi, who had once believed her life was empty and bitter. Her redemption, through Ruth and Boaz, is complete. Ruth's story, which began with loss and tragedy, ends with fullness and joy, not just for her, but for all of Israel, as her faithfulness plays a part in God's larger redemptive plan. Ruth is not just a love story, it's a redemption story, both personal and cosmic. On the surface, it's a tale of loyalty, family, and kindness. But beneath that lies a narrative of God's providence, weaving even the smallest, most seemingly insignificant lives into his grand plan of salvation. Ruth's journey, from a foreign widow to the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king, demonstrates that God's grace knows no boundaries, and that he can use anyone, regardless of their background, to accomplish his purposes. This story is also a powerful reminder that redemption is not just a distant hope. It's something God is actively working out in our daily lives, through our relationships, our choices, and our faith. Ruth's faithfulness and Boaz's kindness reflect the heart of God, who, as the ultimate Redeemer, invites us all to take part in his family, no matter where we come from. In the midst of a period of national chaos and spiritual decline, the book of Ruth offers a picture of God's quiet but relentless work of redemption. As we see Ruth's life transformed from despair to joy, we are reminded that God's faithfulness never fails, and his plans for redemption are always unfolding, even when we cannot yet see the full picture. The book of 1 Samuel. A shepherd boy slays a giant, and the fate of a nation begins to shift. But as the people celebrate their new hero, the shadows of jealousy and rebellion stir in the heart of a king. The rise of David signals the rise of a kingdom, but the road to the throne is paved with betrayal, battle, and faith. The era of the judges, a time marked by chaos and moral decline, is coming to a close. Though Ruth offered a glimmer of hope, the nation of Israel remains without central leadership, and everyone does what is right in their own eyes. But now, in the book of 1 Samuel, a new era dawns, the age of kings. The people, yearning for stability and unity, look for a leader to bring order to the fractured tribes of Israel. However, as God raises up kings, he first brings forth a prophet who will lay the spiritual groundwork for the monarchy. Samuel, a man dedicated to God from birth. 1 Samuel is the story of Israel's transition from a loose confederation of tribes ruled by judges to a united kingdom under the leadership of a king. But this transition is fraught with tension and failure. The people's demand for a king represents a rejection of God's direct rule, yet God, in his mercy, grants their request. The book follows the rise and fall of Israel's first king, Saul, and introduces David, the shepherd boy who would become Israel's greatest king. Throughout the narrative, God's sovereignty is on display, as he works through both the faithfulness of Samuel and the failures of Saul to bring about his plan for Israel. The story of 1 Samuel begins with the fervent prayers of Hannah, a woman deeply distressed by her barrenness. She pours out her heart to God, vowing that if he grants her a son, she will dedicate him to the Lord's service. God answers her prayer, and Hannah gives birth to Samuel, whom she brings to the temple to be raised by the priest Eli. Samuel's birth is not just an answer to one woman's prayers, it is the beginning of God's plan to restore spiritual leadership in Israel. Samuel grows up hearing the voice of God, and as he matures, he becomes the last judge of Israel, a prophet and a priest. His leadership and integrity contrast sharply with the corruption of Eli's sons, and he becomes the moral and spiritual guide for the nation as they cry out for a king. As Samuel grows older, the people of Israel demand a king to lead them, like the other nations around them. They want a visible ruler to unite and protect them, but in doing so, they reject God as their king. Reluctantly, Samuel brings their request to God, and he instructs Samuel to anoint Saul, a tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin, as Israel's first king. Saul's reign begins with promise. He wins early victories and initially appears to be a capable leader. However, it quickly becomes apparent that Saul's heart is not fully devoted to God. His disobedience and insecurity lead him down a path of pride and rebellion, and God rejects Saul as king. Saul's downfall highlights the dangers of placing one's trust in human leadership over God's sovereignty. As Saul's reign unravels, God sends Samuel to anoint a new king, David, a young shepherd from Bethlehem, the youngest of Jesse's sons. Unlike Saul, David is chosen not for his outward appearance, but for his heart. However, David's path to the throne is not immediate. He first rises to prominence by defeating the Philistine giant, Goliath, with nothing but a sling and a few stones. The battle between David and Goliath is one of the most iconic moments in the Bible, not just because of the underdog victory, but because it marks a turning point in Israel's history. David's courage and faith in God are in stark contrast to Saul's fear and hesitation. With one stone, David not only defeats the giant, but also begins his journey toward the throne. His victory inspires hope in Israel, but it also plants seeds of jealousy in Saul's heart. Saul's jealousy of David consumes him. Though David serves Saul loyally, Saul becomes increasingly paranoid, repeatedly trying to kill David. David, despite having opportunities to retaliate, refuses to harm Saul, recognizing that Saul is still God's anointed king. This period of David's life is marked by hardship as he becomes a fugitive, but it also demonstrates his deep trust in God's timing and sovereignty. Saul's madness and disobedience eventually lead to his tragic death in battle. Mortally wounded and defeated by the Philistines, Saul falls on his own sword, marking the end of his reign. His death paves the way for David's ascension to the throne, but it also stands as a sobering reminder of what happens when a leader abandons God's guidance. The Book of 2 Samuel. With Saul's death, the stage is set for David to ascend to the throne. But the transition is not smooth. The house of Saul still has supporters, and the path to unity is marked by civil strife and personal sacrifice. As David assumes leadership, he begins the process of consolidating power, securing Israel's borders, and establishing Jerusalem as the nation's political and spiritual center. However, as his power grows, so too do the temptations and failures that will come to define his reign. 2 Samuel tells the story of David's reign over Israel, marked by both triumph and tragedy. David is a king after God's own heart, a leader who unites the tribes, expands the kingdom, and establishes a dynasty that will ultimately lead to the Messiah. But even David, the man chosen by God, is not without sin. His personal failures, most notably his sin with Bathsheba, cast a shadow over his reign, leading to devastating consequences within his family and kingdom. Yet through it all, God's promise to David remains, pointing to a greater king who will come from David's line and establish an eternal kingdom. After Saul's death, David is anointed king over Judah, while Saul's son Ishbosheth is made king over the northern tribes of Israel. A period of civil war ensues, but David's strength and popularity grow. Eventually, Ishbosheth is murdered, and the tribes of Israel come to David, asking him to be their king. David is anointed king over all Israel, bringing unity to the nation for the first time since the days of Joshua. David establishes Jerusalem as the capital, a strategic and neutral location, and brings the Ark of the Covenant to the city, making it the spiritual center of Israel. This act symbolizes David's desire to unite the nation, not just politically, but spiritually, under the worship of God. One of the most significant moments in David's reign comes when God makes a covenant with him. Through the prophet Nathan, God promises that David's throne will be established forever, and that one of his descendants will build a house for God. This promise, known as the Davidic covenant, becomes the foundation for Israel's messianic hope. Though David desires to build a temple for the Lord, God declares that it will be his son who will complete the task. Instead, God promises to establish David's dynasty, ensuring that his descendants will rule over Israel. This covenant points forward to Jesus, the ultimate descendant of David, who will reign as king over an eternal kingdom. Despite his successes, David's reign is marred by a devastating personal failure. While his army is off fighting, David sees Bathsheba, the wife of one of his soldiers, and commits adultery with her. When Bathsheba becomes pregnant, David tries to cover up his sin by bringing her husband, Uriah, back from the battlefield. When Uriah refuses to go home to his wife, David arranges for him to be killed in battle. David's sin with Bathsheba leads to severe consequences. The prophet Nathan confronts David, delivering a message of judgment from God. Though David is forgiven, the sword will never depart from his house. This moment marks a turning point in David's reign. His personal sin leads to turmoil within his family, and the peace and prosperity of his kingdom begin to unravel. One of the most heartbreaking consequences of David's sin is the rebellion of his son Absalom. After years of growing resentment, Absalom leads a revolt against his father, seeking to take the throne by force. David is forced to flee Jerusalem, and a civil war breaks out between those loyal to David and those supporting Absalom. The conflict reaches its tragic climax when Absalom is killed in battle, despite David's pleas to spare his life. David's grief over his son's death is profound, and it serves as a reminder of the heavy cost of his earlier sins. Though David is restored to his throne, the rebellion leaves deep scars on his family and kingdom. The Book of 1 Kings. A kingdom built on wisdom crumbles into division, proving that even the wisest of men are not immune to failure. Solomon's rise is as spectacular as his fall, and the once united Israel fractures into two kingdoms, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and spiritual decline. As 2 Samuel ends, David's reign comes to a close, and his son Solomon ascends to the throne of Israel. Solomon inherits a united and prosperous kingdom, blessed by God's promise to David. However, the Book of 1 Kings tells the story of how this golden age of Israel's unity and peace is shattered by division. The kingdom built on the wisdom of Solomon slowly begins to unravel, leading to a fractured nation and a long, tumultuous history of kings, prophets, and conflict. 1 Kings marks the beginning of Israel's monarchy after David, focusing on the reign of Solomon, whose wisdom, wealth, and power were unmatched. However, it is also a story of how the glory of Solomon's reign turns into the tragedy of division and decline. The kingdom, once united under David, splits into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This division is a result of political tension, spiritual decline, and the consequences of Solomon's own disobedience in later years. The Book of 1 Kings tells the story of both Israel and Judah's rulers, illustrating how a once glorious kingdom crumbles under the weight of idolatry, poor leadership, and disobedience to God. While some kings seek to follow God's law, many others lead the people into further sin, ultimately setting the stage for future destruction. Early in his reign, Solomon prays for wisdom to govern God's people, and God grants him unparalleled understanding and insight. Solomon's wisdom becomes legendary, attracting visitors from across the world, including the Queen of Sheba. His rule is marked by peace, prosperity, and unparalleled wealth. Under Solomon's leadership, Israel reaches the height of its influence and power. Solomon's wisdom is demonstrated in his famous judgment between two women claiming to be the mother of a baby. His decision reveals a deep understanding of human nature, and his reign begins with great promise. However, this wisdom, though divinely given, is not enough to keep Solomon from making fatal mistakes later in life. One of Solomon's greatest accomplishments is the building of the Temple in Jerusalem, a permanent dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant, and a center for Israel's worship. The temple is a magnificent structure, built with the finest materials and craftsmanship. It becomes the spiritual and symbolic heart of Israel, representing God's presence among his people. At the dedication of the temple, Solomon offers a powerful prayer, acknowledging God's faithfulness and asking for his continued blessing and guidance. The glory of the Lord fills the temple, signifying God's approval. However, Solomon also warns the people that if they turn away from God, the very temple they celebrate will be destroyed. Despite his wisdom, Solomon's heart is led astray in his later years. He marries many foreign wives, and they turn his heart toward their gods. Solomon begins to tolerate and even participate in idolatry, building high places for the worship of foreign deities. This disobedience to God's commands sows the seeds of division and decline in Israel. As a result of Solomon's unfaithfulness, God declares that the kingdom will be torn from Solomon's line after his death, though for David's sake, Judah will remain under the rule of his descendants. Solomon's reign, which began with wisdom and glory, ends in compromise and idolatry, setting the stage for the kingdom's division. After Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam takes the throne. However, Rehoboam's harsh policies and refusal to listen to wise counsel lead to a rebellion among the northern tribes. They choose Jeroboam, a former servant of Solomon, as their king, and the kingdom is split in two.
Israel in the north with Jeroboam as king, and Judah in the south, ruled by Rehoboam. Jeroboam leads Israel into idolatry by establishing golden calves in Bethel and Dan, fearing that if the people continue to worship in Jerusalem, their loyalty will return to the house of David. This marks the beginning of a long history of idolatry and corruption in the northern kingdom, while Judah struggles with its own challenges under Rehoboam's poor leadership. The Book of 2 Kings. When kings forget their God, nations crumble. The exile was not just a political event, but a spiritual reckoning. As the kingdoms of Israel and Judah fall, the prophet's warnings ring true. Without faithfulness to God, even the mightiest nations cannot stand. The division of the kingdom sets the tone for the rest of Israel's history. 1 Kings ended with a fractured Israel and Judah, each struggling under the weight of poor leadership and increasing idolatry. Now, in 2 Kings, we follow the tragic and inevitable decline of both kingdoms. Though prophets like Elijah and Elisha are sent by God to call the people back to faithfulness, the kings continue to lead their people into deeper sin. The consequences of disobedience come to a head as both kingdoms are ultimately conquered, fulfilling the warnings of the prophets. 2 Kings continues the story of the divided kingdom, chronicling the reigns of various kings in both Israel and Judah. The northern kingdom, Israel, is characterized by a rapid decline into idolatry and immorality, culminating in its conquest by Assyria. Judah, though it experiences moments of revival under righteous kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, ultimately falls into the same patterns of disobedience and is conquered by Babylon, leading to the exile. While the political narrative of 2 Kings is one of decline, the book also emphasizes the work of the prophets, especially Elisha, who perform miracles and deliver messages from God, calling the people to repentance. Despite their efforts, the kings and the people largely refuse to listen, and the fall of both kingdoms becomes inevitable. The prophet Elisha, who succeeds Elijah, plays a central role in 2 Kings, performing many miracles that demonstrate God's power and compassion. Elisha heals the sick, raises the dead, multiplies food, and even parts the Jordan River. Through these miraculous acts, Elisha shows that God is still present and active in Israel, even as the nation spirals deeper into sin. Elisha's miracles are also a reminder that God's mercy is still available to those who seek Him. Even in the midst of widespread idolatry, individuals like the Shunammite woman and Naaman the Syrian experience God's grace through Elisha's ministry. The northern kingdom of Israel is marked by a long line of wicked kings who lead the people further away from God. Despite repeated warnings from the prophets, the people refuse to repent, and eventually God's judgment falls. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire conquers Israel, and the capital city of Samaria is destroyed. The people are taken into exile, scattered among the nations, and the northern kingdom ceases to exist. The fall of Samaria is not just a political event. It is a spiritual reckoning. The destruction of Israel is the direct result of the people's persistent idolatry and rejection of God's covenant. This moment marks the beginning of the end for the once great nation of Israel. Though the northern kingdom is lost, the southern kingdom of Judah experiences moments of revival under kings like Hezekiah and Josiah. Hezekiah is known for his faithfulness to God, trusting him in the face of the Assyrian threat. When the Assyrians besiege Jerusalem, Hezekiah prays, and God miraculously delivers the city, sending an angel to destroy the Assyrian army. Later, Josiah leads a spiritual renewal in Judah, rediscovering the Book of the Law and leading the people in a covenant renewal ceremony. He tears down idols, cleanses the temple, and restores proper worship. However, despite these efforts, the hearts of the people remain far from God, and after Josiah's death, Judah quickly returns to idolatry. The final chapters of 2 Kings tell the tragic story of Judah's fall. As the nation drifts further into idolatry and injustice, God allows the Babylonian Empire, led by Nebuchadnezzar, to conquer Jerusalem. In 586 BC, Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is burned, and the people of Judah are taken into exile in Babylon. This marks the end of the Davidic kingdom, as the city of David is left in ruins and the people are scattered. The exile is a profound moment in Israel's history. It is not merely the result of political failure, but is portrayed as a direct consequence of the nation's unfaithfulness to God. The destruction of the temple, the symbol of God's presence among his people, signifies the depth of Israel's spiritual decline. 1 Kings and 2 Kings together tell the tragic story of how a kingdom that began with such promise under David and Solomon descended into division, disobedience, and destruction. These books are a testament to the consequences of turning away from God. While there are moments of faithfulness and revival, the overarching narrative is one of decline as the kings and the people of Israel and Judah fail to keep the covenant with God. Yet, even in the midst of judgment, God's mercy endures. Through the prophets, God continually calls his people back to himself, offering grace and hope. The exile, though devastating, is not the end of Israel's story. It sets the stage for a future return and the eventual coming of the true king from David's line, Jesus Christ, who will establish a kingdom that will never fall. The Book of 1 Chronicles. In the genealogies and victories of David, God's eternal promise to Israel shines through. From the first man to the greatest king, the story of God's faithfulness unfolds, leading to the day when his presence will dwell in the temple and his promises will be fulfilled through David's line. As the narrative of 1 and 2 Kings concludes with the fall of Israel and Judah, the story appears to be one of utter defeat. However, the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles offer a different perspective, a retelling of Israel's history, but with a renewed focus on hope, covenant, and the promises of God. Written for a post-exilic community returning from Babylon, 1 Chronicles emphasizes the Davidic line and God's enduring commitment to his people, even in the face of their failures. Through genealogies and the story of David's reign, the book traces God's faithfulness to his covenant with Israel, pointing to a future restoration. 1 Chronicles revisits the history of Israel, focusing on David's lineage and reign. Unlike the accounts in 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, which include many of David's personal struggles and failures, 1 Chronicles highlights David's role as the chosen king who establishes Israel as a powerful nation. The emphasis is on God's eternal covenant with David, which promises that his line will continue forever, ultimately culminating in the Messiah. The genealogies serve as a reminder that God's plan has been in motion since the beginning, through every generation, and will not be thwarted. The book presents David as a man after God's own heart, who, despite his imperfections, is used by God to prepare Israel for its most significant spiritual milestone, the building of the temple. 1 Chronicles opens with extensive genealogies, tracing Israel's history from Adam to the 12 tribes, focusing especially on the line of David. These genealogies are more than just a list of names. They connect the exiled community to their heritage, reminding them of their identity as God's chosen people. Each name represents a link in the chain of God's promise, showing that despite their past failures, Israel's story is far from over. These genealogies also emphasize the continuity of God's covenant with Israel. From Adam through Abraham, and finally to David, the promise of a king from David's line shines through, giving hope to a people who have experienced exile and destruction. The heart of 1 Chronicles focuses on David's reign, presenting him as the ideal king who unites Israel and establishes Jerusalem as the center of worship. David's military victories are recounted, showcasing how God's favor and guidance lead Israel to triumph over its enemies. However, the chronicler omits some of the more difficult moments in David's life, such as his sin with Bathsheba, focusing instead on his role as a king who loves God and seeks to build a nation dedicated to worshiping him. David's reign is seen as a model of what it looks like when a king leads with a heart after God. One of the most important themes in 1 Chronicles is David's preparation for the building of the temple. Though David is not permitted to build the temple himself because of his history as a warrior, he takes significant steps to ensure that his son, Solomon, will be able to carry out this monumental task. David gathers materials, organizes the Levites and priests, and provides detailed plans for the temple's construction. His passion for the temple reflects his deep desire for God's presence to dwell among his people in a permanent and sacred place. This preparation underscores the central role that worship and the temple will play in the life of Israel and in the legacy of David's reign. The book concludes with David's final instructions to Solomon and the leaders of Israel, emphasizing the importance of obedience to God's commands and devotion to temple worship. David's final words are a reminder of the covenant promise, that through his line, Israel's future king would come, and the temple would be the center of God's presence among his people. David's legacy is not just in his military conquests or political achievements, but in his heart for God, and his role in establishing a foundation for future worship. The Book of 2 Chronicles. The temple stood as a beacon, but when kings turned away from worship, the light of the kingdom dimmed. From Solomon's golden reign to the ashes of Jerusalem's destruction, the story of the kings reminds us that true strength lies not in power or wealth, but in faithfulness to God. While 1 Chronicles focuses on the rise of David and his preparations for the temple, 2 Chronicles continues the story, focusing on the reign of Solomon, the building of the temple, and the long succession of kings who follow. As the narrative moves through the generations of Judah's kings, the central question is this: will the kings remain faithful to the covenant and uphold the worship of God in the temple? Or will they turn away, leading the nation into darkness? 2 Chronicles chronicles the reign of Solomon and the kings of Judah, with a particular focus on the role of the temple and worship in Israel's national life. Solomon's reign is marked by wisdom, wealth, and the building of the glorious temple in Jerusalem. But the book also recounts the decline that follows when subsequent kings turn away from God. The temple, built as a place for God's presence, stands as both a symbol of hope and a warning. When kings and the people honor God, the kingdom thrives, but when they forsake him, the kingdom falls into ruin. The book ends with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the exile of the people to Babylon, and a glimmer of hope for future restoration. Through it all, the temple remains at the heart of the story, representing the spiritual health of the nation. The early chapters of 2 Chronicles are devoted to Solomon's reign, emphasizing his wisdom, wealth, and, most importantly, the construction of the temple. Solomon's request for wisdom, granted by God, leads to an era of unprecedented prosperity and peace for Israel. The temple Solomon builds is described in great detail, reflecting its importance as the dwelling place of God's presence among his people. Solomon's dedication of the temple is one of the high points in Israel's history. As he prays, fire comes down from heaven, and the glory of the Lord fills the temple, signifying God's approval. Solomon's prayer acknowledges the greatness of God and the need for the people to remain faithful to his commands. However, Solomon's later years are marked by compromises and idolatry, foreshadowing the struggles that will plague future kings. After Solomon's death, the kingdom divides, but 2 Chronicles focuses on the southern kingdom of Judah and its kings. The narrative highlights both the righteous kings who lead the people back to God and the wicked kings who lead them astray. David's military victories are recounted, showcasing how God's favor and guidance lead Israel to triumph over its enemies. However, the chronicler omits some of the more difficult moments in David's life, such as his sin with Bathsheba, focusing instead on his role as a king who loves God and seeks to build a nation dedicated to worshiping him. David's reign is seen as a model of what it looks like when a king leads with a heart after God. One of the most important themes in 1 Chronicles is David's preparation for the building of the temple. Though David is not permitted to build the temple himself because of his history as a warrior, he takes significant steps to ensure that his son, Solomon, will be able to carry out this monumental task. David gathers materials, organizes the Levites and priests, and provides detailed plans for the temple's construction. His passion for the temple reflects his deep desire for God's presence to dwell among his people in a permanent and sacred place. This preparation underscores the central role that worship and the temple will play in the life of Israel and in the legacy of David's reign. The book concludes with David's final instructions to Solomon and the leaders of Israel, emphasizing the importance of obedience to God's commands and devotion to temple worship. David's final words are a reminder of the covenant promise that through his line, Israel's future king would come, and the temple would be the center of God's presence among his people. David's legacy is not just in his military conquests or political achievements, but in his heart for God and his role in establishing a foundation for future worship. The Book of 2 Chronicles. The temple stood as a beacon, but when kings turned away from worship, the light of the kingdom dimmed. From Solomon's golden reign to the ashes of Jerusalem's destruction, the story of the kings reminds us that true strength lies not in power or wealth, but in faithfulness to God. While 1 Chronicles focuses on the rise of David and his preparations for the temple, 2 Chronicles continues the story, focusing on the reign of Solomon, the building of the temple, and the long succession of kings who follow. As the narrative moves through the generations of Judah's kings, the central question is this: will the kings remain faithful to the covenant and uphold the worship of God in the temple? Or will they turn away, leading the nation into darkness? 2 Chronicles chronicles the reign of Solomon and the kings of Judah, with a particular focus on the role of the temple and worship in Israel's national life. Solomon's reign is marked by wisdom, wealth, and the building of the glorious temple in Jerusalem. But the book also recounts the decline that follows when subsequent kings turn away from God. The temple, built as a place for God's presence, stands as both a symbol of hope and a warning. When kings and the people honor God, the kingdom thrives, but when they forsake him, the kingdom falls into ruin. The book ends with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the exile of the people to Babylon, and a glimmer of hope for future restoration. Through it all, the temple remains at the heart of the story, representing the spiritual health of the nation. The early chapters of 2 Chronicles are devoted to Solomon's reign, emphasizing his wisdom, wealth, and, most importantly, The construction of the temple. Solomon's request for wisdom, granted by God, leads to an era of unprecedented prosperity and peace for Israel. The temple Solomon builds is described in great detail, reflecting its importance as the dwelling place of God's presence among his people. Solomon's dedication of the temple is one of the high points in Israel's history. As he prays, fire comes down from heaven, and the glory of the Lord fills the temple, signifying God's approval. Solomon's prayer acknowledges the greatness of God and the need for the people to remain faithful to his commands. However, Solomon's later years are marked by compromises and idolatry, foreshadowing the struggles that will plague future kings. After Solomon's death, the kingdom divides, but 2 Chronicles focuses on the southern kingdom of Judah and its kings. The narrative highlights both the righteous kings who lead the people back to God and the wicked kings who lead them astray. Kings like Hezekiah and Josiah stand out as examples of faithfulness, initiating reforms and restoring proper worship in the temple. Hezekiah faces the threat of the Assyrian army and responds with faith, seeking God's deliverance, which comes in the form of a miraculous defeat of the Assyrians. Hezekiah also cleanses the temple and reestablishes the Passover, leading the people in spiritual renewal. Josiah similarly brings about major reforms after discovering the Book of the Law in the temple. His passion for God's word leads to the destruction of idols and the restoration of worship. However, even these moments of revival cannot prevent the overall decline of the nation, as later kings abandon the covenant and fall into idolatry. As the kings of Judah increasingly turn away from God, the kingdom falls into political and spiritual decline. The people forsake the temple, worship idols, and ignore the warnings of the prophets. Finally, God's judgment comes upon Judah. The Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar, invade, destroying Jerusalem and the temple, and carrying the people into exile in Babylon. The destruction of the temple is a devastating blow, symbolizing the breaking of the covenant and the loss of God's presence among his people. The book ends on a tragic note, but not without hope. The final verses point to the decree of Cyrus the Great, allowing the exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, signaling the beginning of restoration. 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles retell the story of Israel's history, with a focus on the Davidic line and the central role of the temple in the life of the nation. While 1 Chronicles celebrates the reign of David and his preparation for the temple, 2 Chronicles shows how the fortunes of the kingdom rise and fall based on the faithfulness of its kings to God's covenant. These books serve as both a reminder and a warning to the post-exilic community. God's promises to David remain, but the people must remain faithful to their covenant with him. The temple, though destroyed, will be rebuilt, and the hope of a future king from David's line remains alive. Chronicles looks back at Israel's past with an eye toward the future, a future where worship, covenant, and the presence of God remain central to the life of his people. The Book of Ezra. The people returned to rebuild not just a city, but a relationship with their God. As the foundations of the temple were laid, hope stirred in the hearts of the exiles. But the true foundation being restored was far more important, the foundation of faith and obedience to the God who had brought them back. As 2 Chronicles ends, we witness the tragic fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the exile of the people to Babylon. However, the final verses of the book offer a glimmer of hope. The decree of Cyrus the Great, allowing the Israelites to return home and rebuild the temple. This marks the beginning of the restoration of Israel, both physically and spiritually. The book of Ezra picks up where 2 Chronicles leaves off, chronicling the return from exile and the renewal of Israel's identity as God's chosen people. Ezra tells the story of Israel's return from exile, focusing on the spiritual and communal rebuilding that takes place upon their return to Jerusalem. The central theme of the book is restoration, not just of the temple, but of the people's relationship with God. After decades of living in a foreign land, the Israelites are given the chance to return home and restore what had been lost. But their task is not just to rebuild the physical structures of Jerusalem. They must also renew their covenant with God, purify their worship, and re-establish themselves as a people set apart for His purposes. Ezra, a priest and scribe, emerges as a key leader during this period. His primary concern is not just the physical rebuilding of the temple, but the spiritual reformation of the people. Through his leadership, the Israelites rediscover the importance of obedience to the law of God, and they begin the difficult work of renewing their faith and identity. The book of Ezra begins with the decree of Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, who allows the exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This decree is a fulfillment of prophecy, as both Isaiah and Jeremiah had foretold that God would stir the heart of a foreign ruler to restore His people. Cyrus not only permits the return, but he also provides financial support for the rebuilding efforts. The return of the exiles marks the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's history. After 70 years in Babylon, the people are finally able to return to their homeland. However, they return to a city in ruins and a nation that has lost its former glory. The task ahead is immense, both physically and spiritually. One of the first priorities for the returning exiles is the rebuilding of the temple, the center of Israel's worship and identity. Led by Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, and Joshua, the high priest, the people begin the work of laying the foundation for the new temple. This act is symbolic of Israel's desire to restore their relationship with God, as the temple represents His presence among them. However, the rebuilding process is met with opposition from surrounding peoples, who seek to frustrate the efforts of the Israelites. Despite these challenges, the foundation is laid, and the people rejoice. But the older generation, who had seen the glory of Solomon's temple, weep, recognizing that the new temple is but a shadow of what once stood. Still, the rebuilding of the temple represents a significant step in Israel's spiritual renewal. Many years after the temple is completed, Ezra, a skilled scribe and priest, arrives in Jerusalem with the task of teaching the law of God and leading the people in spiritual reform. Ezra's leadership is focused on re-establishing the importance of the Torah and guiding the people back to a life of obedience. Upon arriving, Ezra is confronted with a troubling issue: the intermarriage of the Israelites with surrounding nations. This compromise threatens the spiritual purity of the people and undermines their distinct identity as God's chosen nation. Ezra leads the people in a public confession of their sins, and drastic measures are taken to restore holiness to the community. Ezra's reforms are not just about following rules, they are about renewing the people's relationship with God and re-establishing the covenant that had been broken. Through his leadership, the Israelites are reminded that their return to the land is not just about rebuilding physical structures, but about becoming a people who are faithful to God's word. The Book of Nehemiah. Against all odds, the walls of Jerusalem rose again, a symbol of God's unwavering faithfulness. With every stone laid, the people of Israel rebuilt not just their city, but their hope. In the face of opposition, Nehemiah's courage and trust in God became the foundation for a nation restored. While Ezra focuses on the spiritual and religious restoration of Israel, the book of Nehemiah shifts the focus to the physical rebuilding of Jerusalem. The temple has been restored, but the city's walls lie in ruins, leaving it vulnerable to attack and its people demoralized. Nehemiah, a trusted servant in the Persian court, hears of the plight of his people and is moved to action. Just as Ezra had restored the people's spiritual identity, Nehemiah will now lead them in the rebuilding of the city's physical defenses, restoring not only their security, but also their confidence as a nation. Nehemiah tells the story of a man with a deep sense of duty to God and his people. Though serving as cupbearer to the Persian king, Nehemiah's heart is with the people of Jerusalem. Upon hearing that the walls of the city remain in ruins, Nehemiah prays to God for favor and courage. He then boldly asks the king for permission to return to Jerusalem and lead the effort to rebuild the walls. The rebuilding of the walls represents more than just physical protection. It symbolizes the restoration of the nation's dignity and faith. Nehemiah's leadership is marked by perseverance, wisdom, and an unwavering reliance on God. Despite facing intense opposition from external enemies and internal conflict, Nehemiah succeeds in completing the wall, demonstrating God's faithfulness to his people. The story begins with Nehemiah hearing a report about the condition of Jerusalem, which is described as a city without walls, defenseless and vulnerable. Moved to tears, Nehemiah prays fervently, confessing the sins of his people and asking God to grant him favor with the king. Nehemiah approaches King Artaxerxes with a bold request to be sent to Jerusalem to rebuild the city's walls. Remarkably, the king grants his request, providing Nehemiah with the necessary resources and authority to carry out the project. This act of faith and courage sets the tone for the rest of Nehemiah's leadership, as he steps into a monumental task that will require both spiritual and physical strength. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, Nehemiah surveys the damage and immediately begins organizing the people to rebuild the walls. The work is divided among families and groups, each assigned to a specific section of the wall. The speed and efficiency with which the work progresses is a testament to Nehemiah's organizational skills and his ability to inspire the people. However, the rebuilding effort is not without opposition. Sanballat, Tobiah, and other enemies of Israel plot to sabotage the work, mocking and threatening the builders. Nehemiah responds with both prayer and practical action. He arms the workers, posting guards and encouraging the people to trust in God's protection. Despite the constant threats, the wall is completed in just 52 days, a remarkable achievement that demonstrates God's hand at work. Nehemiah's leadership is tested not only by external enemies, but also by internal strife. As the people work tirelessly to rebuild the wall, Nehemiah discovers that many of the poor are being oppressed by their wealthier brethren. People are forced to mortgage their fields and sell their children into servitude to survive. This internal injustice threatens to derail the entire project. Nehemiah confronts the nobles and officials, calling them to repentance and demanding that they return the land and forgive the debts of their fellow Israelites. His leadership in this moment reflects his deep commitment to justice and his understanding that the rebuilding of the walls is meaningless if the community itself is divided and unjust. With the walls completed, Nehemiah leads the people in a grand dedication ceremony. The walls, which had once symbolized Jerusalem's vulnerability and disgrace, now stand as a testament to God's faithfulness and the perseverance of his people. The city is once again secure, and the people can begin to rebuild their lives with confidence. During the dedication, Ezra reads from the book of the law, and the people respond with joy and worship. The spiritual renewal that began under Ezra is now complete, as the physical and spiritual restoration of Jerusalem is celebrated in unison. Ezra and Nehemiah together tell the story of Israel's restoration, both spiritually and physically, after the Babylonian exile. While Ezra focuses on the renewal of worship and adherence to God's law, Nehemiah highlights the importance of leadership, perseverance, and community in rebuilding a nation. Through these two leaders, we see that God's plan for restoration involves both the heart and the hands, renewing the people's faith and their physical city. These books remind us that true restoration is not just about returning to the land or rebuilding walls. It's about returning to God and renewing our commitment to Him. Whether facing external opposition or internal struggles, the story of Ezra and Nehemiah demonstrates that when God's people trust in His promises and work together in unity, they can overcome any obstacle. The rebuilding of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem stands as a powerful testament to God's enduring faithfulness, even in the most difficult of times. The Book of Esther. In the shadows of a Persian palace, a woman's courage changes the fate of her people. With everything at stake, Esther steps into her moment, reminding us that God's providence is at work, even when he seems silent. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe the return of the Jews from Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. However, many Jews remained scattered throughout the vast Persian Empire. It is within this setting that the story of Esther unfolds. Unlike the returnees, Esther and her people live under Persian rule, and while they are not in physical captivity, they face a different kind of threat, one that could lead to their annihilation. The Book of Esther is a powerful reminder of God's providence and his ability to work through unlikely individuals to accomplish his purposes, even in a foreign land. The Book of Esther tells the dramatic story of how a young Jewish woman becomes the queen of Persia and, through courage and divine timing, saves her people from destruction. Though God is never mentioned directly in the book, his presence and providence are evident throughout the narrative. The Jewish people, living in exile, face a genocidal plot orchestrated by a high-ranking official named Haman. Esther, who has risen to the position of queen, must decide whether to risk her life by revealing her Jewish identity and pleading for her people. The story highlights themes of courage, identity, and God's hidden hand in human affairs. Esther's journey from an orphaned girl to a queen who changes the fate of her people illustrates that God can use anyone, regardless of their background, to accomplish his will. The story begins with King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, deposing his queen, Vashti, after she refuses to appear before him and his officials. A search is conducted throughout the empire to find a new queen, and Esther, a young Jewish woman raised by her cousin Mordecai, is chosen for her beauty and grace. Esther's rise to queenship is nothing short of remarkable, especially considering her humble origins. However, she keeps her Jewish identity a secret at Mordecai's instruction. Though she is now queen, Esther's true calling will only become clear when her people face an existential threat. Enter Haman, a powerful official in the Persian court who becomes enraged when Mordecai, Esther's cousin, refuses to bow to him. Haman's pride leads him to plot not only Mordecai's destruction, but also the annihilation of all Jews in the Persian Empire. He persuades King Xerxes to issue a decree allowing the extermination of the Jewish people on a particular day. The decree is devastating, and Mordecai urges Esther to act. He famously tells her, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Esther 4:14. Esther is faced with a choice: remain silent and protect herself or risk her life by approaching the king to plead for her people. In a tense and dramatic moment, Esther decides to act. Knowing that approaching the king without being summoned could result in her death, she nevertheless enters the royal court. The king, captivated by Esther's courage and beauty, extends his scepter, granting her permission to speak. Esther invites the king and Haman to a series of banquets, using the opportunity to win the king's favor. At the second banquet, Esther reveals her Jewish identity and exposes Haman's plot. The king, furious at Haman's treachery, orders him to be hanged on the very gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai. Esther's courage and wisdom lead to the downfall of Haman and the salvation of her people. Though Haman is defeated, the decree allowing the extermination of the Jews remains in effect, as Persian law cannot be revoked. However, King Xerxes, at Esther's request, issues a new decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies. When the day of the attack arrives, the Jews are victorious and their enemies are defeated. The book ends with the institution of the Festival of Purim, a celebration of the Jews' deliverance and a reminder of God's hidden hand in their salvation. Through Esther's bravery and Mordecai's guidance, the Jewish people are saved from destruction, and the story stands as a testament to the power of faith, courage, and God's providence. The Book of Job. When everything is taken away, where do we turn? Job's story challenges us to trust in a God who is beyond our understanding. Even in the depths of suffering, God's wisdom and power shine through, calling us to faith in the face of life's deepest mysteries. While the Book of Esther tells a story of deliverance from external threats, the Book of Job delves into the internal struggle of a man facing intense personal suffering. Job's journey is not about political survival or physical rescue. It's about wrestling with profound questions of faith, justice, and the nature of suffering. Job offers a timeless exploration of the human condition, addressing the question that has plagued humanity for centuries: why do the righteous suffer? The Book of Job tells the story of a man who, despite his righteousness and faithfulness to God, experiences unimaginable suffering. God's response is not an explanation but a revelation of his transcendence. Job, overwhelmed by the magnitude of God's wisdom, humbly acknowledges his limitations and repents for questioning God's justice. The message is clear. While human beings may not understand the reasons for suffering, they are called to trust in God's greater plan, which is beyond their comprehension. In the end, God restores Job's fortunes, blessing him with even more than he had before. Job's health is restored, his wealth is doubled, and he is blessed with more children. However, the restoration does not negate the reality of Job's suffering. Job's story does not offer simple answers to the problem of suffering, but it does demonstrate that God is faithful, even in the midst of unimaginable pain. Job's journey from suffering to restoration reminds us that while we may not always understand why we suffer, we can trust in the goodness and sovereignty of God, who is always working in ways beyond our understanding. Esther and Job offer two very different but equally profound reflections on the nature of faith and God's involvement in human affairs. Esther's story reminds us of God's providence and the power of courage and faithfulness in the face of danger. Her rise to queenship and her brave decision to act on behalf of her people illustrate that God can use anyone to accomplish his purposes, even when his hand is not immediately visible. Job, on the other hand, delves into the mystery of suffering, offering no easy answers but challenging readers to trust in God's sovereignty. Job's unwavering faith in the face of profound loss and God's eventual response reveal that while we may not always understand why suffering occurs, we are called to trust in the God who created the universe and holds all things in his hands. Both stories invite us to deeper trust in God's plan, whether in moments of triumph or in seasons of suffering, and remind us that God is always present, even when we cannot see him. The Book of Psalms. From the depths of despair to the heights of joy, the Psalms give voice to the soul's deepest cries. In every season of life, these songs remind us that God hears, God cares, and God is worthy of our praise. Following the profound reflections on suffering and God's sovereignty in Job, the Book of Psalms opens the door to the raw and intimate relationship between humanity and God. The Psalms are not just theological reflections. They are the cries, praises, and prayers of real people wrestling with life's deepest emotions. Whether in times of joy, sorrow, fear, or triumph, the Psalms give voice to the full range of human experience, inviting us into a deeper, more honest dialogue with God. The Book of Psalms is a diverse collection of 150 prayers, songs, and poems that capture the heart's deepest longings and emotions. Authored primarily by David, though other writers such as Asaph and the sons of Korah also contributed, the Psalms explore the vast spectrum of human life in relation to God. From moments of overwhelming despair to exuberant praise, the Psalms express humanity's yearning for connection with the divine. Psalms is often referred to as the Songbook of Israel because it was used in both private devotion and public worship. Each psalm offers a glimpse into the spiritual journey of the psalmist and provides a framework for expressing our own emotions before God. Themes of repentance, thanksgiving, deliverance, and trust run throughout the Psalms, showing us that no matter our circumstance, God is present, listening, and worthy of praise. Many of the Psalms were written during the most difficult moments of David's life, when he was fleeing from Saul, hiding from enemies, or facing the consequences of his own sins. Psalms 51 is one of the most famous laments written after David's sin with Bathsheba. In it, David pleads for God's mercy and forgiveness, recognizing his brokenness and guilt. He prays, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me," Psalm 51:10. Other laments, such as Psalm 22, capture David's feelings of abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me?" These raw cries for help reflect the human experience of feeling distant from God in times of suffering, yet they also show a deep trust that God will eventually come to deliver. The Psalms also overflow with praises of God's creation, reflecting the beauty and majesty of the world He has made. Psalm 19 proclaims, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands." These psalms of creation help us to see the world as a testament to God's greatness and power. Psalm 8 marvels at God's mindfulness of humanity, despite the vastness of creation. "What is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them?" These psalms invite us to join in the wonder and worship of a Creator who is both transcendent and deeply personal. In psalms of trust and deliverance, the writers often turn to God in times of distress, seeking protection from enemies and danger. Psalm 23, one of the most beloved psalms, paints a picture of God as a shepherd, guiding and protecting his flock even in the valley of the shadow of death. In Psalm 46, the psalmist declares, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." These psalms reassure us that no matter what trials we face, we can trust in God's ability to deliver us and be our refuge. The psalms of deliverance remind us that God's faithfulness endures, even in the darkest of circumstances. Many psalms are filled with joy and thanksgiving, celebrating God's goodness and faithfulness. Psalm 100 invites all the earth to shout for joy to the Lord and enter His gates with thanksgiving. These psalms reflect a deep sense of gratitude for God's provision and care, and they call God's people to worship with hearts full of joy. Psalm 150, the final psalm, is a crescendo of praise, commanding all creation to praise the Lord with every instrument and every breath. It serves as a fitting conclusion to the Psalms, summarizing the book's central message that God is always worthy of praise, regardless of our circumstances. The Book of Proverbs. In a world filled with confusion, Proverbs offers a guiding light to walk the path of wisdom. Every choice we make, every word we speak, and every action we take can lead to life or destruction. Wisdom calls out, will we follow? While Psalms gives expression to the emotions and prayers of the heart, the Book of Proverbs offers practical wisdom for living a life that honors God in the everyday moments. If Psalms is the song of the soul, Proverbs is the guidebook for the mind, teaching us how to navigate life with wisdom, integrity, and righteousness. Proverbs calls us to seek wisdom and understanding, emphasizing that a life lived in accordance with God's principles leads to fulfillment, peace, and success. Proverbs is a collection of wise sayings and teachings, many of which are attributed to King Solomon, known for his wisdom. These proverbs address a wide range of topics, from relationships to work, from speech to wealth, all with the goal of teaching how to live a life that reflects righteousness, justice, and integrity. The book is intensely practical, providing guidance for daily living and encouraging readers to seek wisdom above all else. At its core, Proverbs teaches that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs 9:10. This foundational truth frames the entire book, reminding us that true wisdom comes from a reverence for God and a desire to follow His ways. The sayings within Proverbs help us understand the consequences of our choices, whether we choose the path of wisdom or the way of folly. A central theme in Proverbs is the contrast between wisdom and folly, depicted as two women calling out to those who pass by. Lady Wisdom offers life, while folly leads to destruction. Proverbs 1-9 outlines these two paths, showing the benefits of walking in wisdom and the dangers of rejecting it. Proverbs emphasizes that wisdom is not just intellectual knowledge, but a way of life. Wisdom teaches us to fear the Lord, to speak truth, to work diligently, and to treat others with kindness. On the other hand, foolishness leads to ruin, dishonor, and death. The opening chapters invite us to choose wisely, urging us to listen to wisdom's call and avoid the traps of foolishness. Many proverbs deal with relationships, how we interact with family, friends, neighbors, and even enemies. Proverbs 18:21 reminds us, "The tongue has the power of life and death," emphasizing the importance of our words in building or destroying relationships. Proverbs encourages honesty, humility, and kindness in all interactions, warning against deceit, pride, and gossip. The Proverbs also stress the value of righteous living and integrity in relationships. Proverbs 11:3 states, "The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity." The teachings encourage us to be trustworthy and faithful, knowing that righteous behavior leads to lasting peace and favor with others. Proverbs offers much practical wisdom on the subjects of work and wealth, contrasting the diligent worker with the lazy sluggard. Proverbs 10:4 teaches, "Lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth." Hard work is commended, while laziness is condemned as leading to ruin. The book also offers guidance on the proper attitude toward wealth. Proverbs encourages generosity and warns against the love of money, reminding us that whoever trusts in his riches will fall. Proverbs 11, verse 28. The teachings call us to use wealth wisely, to be generous to the poor, and to avoid greed, recognizing that true success comes from trusting in God, not in material gain. Another key focus in Proverbs is the power of our words. Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." The Proverbs consistently remind us that our speech has the power to build up or tear down, to bring peace or stir conflict. Proverbs urges us to use our words wisely, speaking with truth, kindness, and discretion. Proverbs 12, verse 18 warns, "The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." In a world where communication can so easily lead to misunderstanding or harm, Proverbs provides timeless wisdom on how to use our words to bring life and healing. Psalms and Proverbs together form a powerful pair, one addressing the emotions of the heart, the other offering practical guidance for life. Psalms invites us to bring all of our feelings, struggles, and joys before God, trusting that He hears and cares. It teaches us that in every season of life, God is worthy of praise, and that we can always find comfort and hope in Him. Proverbs, on the other hand, provides wisdom for navigating the complexities of life, offering guidance on how to live in a way that honors God and benefits others. It reminds us that true wisdom begins with reverence for God and calls us to pursue righteousness, integrity, and truth in all we do. Together, these books offer a holistic view of the spiritual life, where the heart's emotions and the mind's decisions are both surrendered to God in worship and wisdom. The Book of Ecclesiastes. "All is vanity," says the preacher, but within the emptiness of life, a deeper truth emerges. While wisdom, work, and pleasure may fade, there is a lasting purpose found in the fear of God and obedience to His will. While Proverbs offers practical wisdom for navigating life's challenges, Ecclesiastes takes a step back, offering a more philosophical reflection on the deeper questions of existence. Written by the teacher, traditionally believed to be King Solomon, Ecclesiastes explores the apparent futility of life's pursuits, asking what ultimately gives life meaning. After a lifetime of wealth, wisdom, and experience, the teacher reflects on the temporary nature of all things, leading to a profound exploration of what truly matters under the sun. Ecclesiastes is one of the most contemplative and thought-provoking books of the Bible. The teacher surveys the full range of human endeavors, work, wealth, pleasure, wisdom, and even relationships, only to conclude that all of it is vanity or meaningless when viewed in the context of life's brevity. His reflections are sobering as he highlights the futility of chasing after things that do not last. The book's key refrain, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity," Ecclesiastes 1:2, captures the essence of the teacher's struggle to find meaning in a world that often seems random and unjust. However, Ecclesiastes is not a book of despair. Rather, it points toward a deeper truth. While earthly pursuits may be fleeting, true fulfillment comes from reverence for God and living in accordance with His will. The teacher's journey through disillusionment ultimately leads to the conclusion that life's greatest meaning is found in fearing God and keeping His commandments. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13. The teacher begins by acknowledging the seemingly endless cycles of life. People live, work, and die, but nothing ever seems to change. The sun rises and sets, rivers flow to the sea but never fill it, and generations come and go without leaving a lasting impact. He reflects on the pursuit of knowledge, pleasure, and wealth, only to find that none of these things provide lasting satisfaction. In Ecclesiastes 2 verse 11, he laments, "When I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind." This refrain is repeated throughout the book as the teacher wrestles with the transient nature of life. Yet, within this acknowledgement of life's futility, the teacher also hints at the necessity of finding meaning beyond the material world. Despite being celebrated as the wisest of men, the teacher admits that wisdom, while valuable, has its limitations. In Ecclesiastes 1:18, he observes, "For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief." The pursuit of understanding the world only reveals more mysteries and more injustices, and wisdom alone cannot provide answers to life's ultimate questions. The teacher's reflections remind us that no matter how much we learn or achieve, we cannot escape the inevitability of death. Both the wise and the foolish share the same fate, and this leads the teacher to question the lasting value of wisdom itself. The teacher also reflects on the pursuit of wealth and the enjoyment of life's pleasures. He admits that while wealth can bring temporary satisfaction, it is ultimately fleeting. In Ecclesiastes 5 verse 10, he notes, "Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income." Similarly, the pursuit of pleasure, whether through food, drink, or entertainment, does not bring lasting fulfillment. Even work, something that many find purpose in, is subject to the same sense of futility. The teacher reflects on the fact that after years of toil, a person must leave their wealth to someone who may not appreciate or maintain it. This observation leads to further disillusionment about the value of human labor. After exploring the vanity of all earthly pursuits, the teacher finally arrives at a profound conclusion. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Ecclesiastes 12 verse 13. While life's pleasures, accomplishments, and wisdom may be fleeting, a life lived in reverence for God is not in vain. The book ends with the acknowledgement that while we cannot fully understand the ways of God or the meaning behind all of life's mysteries, we can trust in His sovereignty and live in obedience to Him. Ecclesiastes teaches us to hold our earthly pursuits loosely, recognizing that true meaning is found not in what we achieve, but in our relationship with God. The Book of Song of Solomon. In the beauty of love, we glimpse something sacred, something that reflects the divine passion for His people. Through the tender dialogue of the bride and groom, we see that love, when rooted in commitment and mutual delight, is a gift to be cherished, a reflection of the greater love between God and His people. After the philosophical reflections of Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon offers a refreshing and intimate exploration of love, desire, and the beauty of human relationships. While Ecclesiastes contemplates the meaning of life in the face of its brevity, the Song of Solomon celebrates the timeless joy found in the union of two lovers. Often interpreted as both a literal celebration of marital love and an allegory for God's love for His people, this book reveals the sacredness of love in all its beauty and passion. The Song of Solomon, also known as the Song of Songs, is a poetic dialogue between a bride and groom that celebrates the beauty and passion of love. The language of the poem is rich with imagery, drawing on nature and the senses to describe the physical and emotional connection between the lovers. The Song of Solomon stands out in the Bible as a celebration of romantic love and desire, presenting love as a gift from God to be cherished and honored. Beyond its literal depiction of human love, the book has often been interpreted as an allegory of God's love for Israel, or, in Christian tradition, Christ's love for the church. Through this lens, the longing and delight expressed in the poem reflect the deep and abiding love that God has for His people, a love that is passionate, intimate, and everlasting. The Song of Solomon is structured as a dialogue between a bride, the Shulamite woman, and her groom, with occasional interjections from a chorus of friends. The poem begins with the bride expressing her desire for the groom. "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine." Song of Solomon 1:2. Throughout the poem, the lovers speak tenderly to each other, praising one another's physical beauty and expressing their longing to be together. The vivid descriptions of love, intimacy, and desire celebrate the joy of marital union, portraying love as something pure and sacred. The Song of Solomon is filled with imagery from nature, using the beauty of the natural world to reflect the depth of the couple's love. The bride is compared to a lily among thorns, and the groom is described as a gazelle or a young stag bounding across the mountains. The garden, a recurring symbol throughout the poem, serves as a metaphor for the lovers' relationship, a place of growth, delight, and intimacy. This connection between love and nature suggests that just as the natural world is part of God's creation, so too is human love and desire. Love, when expressed within the bounds of commitment and mutual respect, is seen as a reflection of the divine order. One of the central themes of the Song of Solomon is the pursuit and longing between the bride and groom. There are moments in the poem where the lovers are separated, and the bride searches for her beloved. This longing reflects the idea that love is worth seeking and waiting for, and that true love cannot be forced or rushed. "Do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires," Song of Solomon 2:7, is a refrain repeated throughout the book, emphasizing the importance of patience and timing in relationships. The pursuit of love is seen as a journey, one that requires dedication and commitment. The culmination of the poem is the joyful union of the bride and groom. Their love, which has been expressed in longing and pursuit, is now fulfilled in the joy of their marriage. The celebration of their union is described with vivid and passionate imagery, reflecting the delight they find in each other. The bride declares, "I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine," Song of Solomon 6:3, a statement that reflects the mutual love, devotion, and commitment that the couple shares. Their love is exclusive, faithful, and enduring, embodying the ideal of marital love as a reflection of God's design. Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon together provide a unique contrast in biblical literature. Ecclesiastes confronts the apparent meaninglessness of life's pursuits, leading us to the ultimate conclusion that true meaning is found in reverence for God. It challenges us to look beyond the temporary and fleeting and to live in light of eternity. The Song of Solomon, on the other hand, celebrates one of life's most profound and beautiful experiences: love. It reminds us that within the complexities of human existence, love stands as a sacred gift, a reflection of God's intimate and passionate love for His people. Together, these books teach us that while life may be full of questions and uncertainties, God's love remains a constant source of meaning and joy. Whether in the pursuit of wisdom or in the expression of love, both Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon point us toward a deeper understanding of our relationship with God and with one another. The Book of Isaiah. In the midst of a dark world, a prophet sees a vision of the Holy One of Israel, whose justice will fall, but whose mercy will rise like the dawn. As nations crumble and kings fall, Isaiah's words echo through history, pointing to a coming king who will reign in righteousness and a servant who will suffer for the sins of the world. After hearing the messages of prophets like Amos, Hosea, and Micah, who warned of judgment against Israel and its neighbors, the book of Isaiah takes center stage as one of the most powerful voices in the prophetic tradition. Isaiah speaks not just to the immediate struggles of his people, but to the broader story of God's unfolding plan for humanity. His message is filled with both warnings of imminent judgment and the incredible promise of a future restoration. Isaiah's prophecies stretch beyond his own time, offering a vision of hope through the coming of a Messiah who will establish justice, bring peace, and usher in God's eternal kingdom. The book of Isaiah is a masterpiece of prophetic literature, spanning a broad range of themes from judgment to redemption. Isaiah was called to prophesy during a tumultuous time in Israel's history when the kingdom was divided and foreign powers threatened its very existence. His primary task was to warn the people of Judah about the consequences of their rebellion against God. However, Isaiah's message is not just one of doom. Throughout the book, we find a powerful and enduring hope, a promise of a coming king, the Messiah, who will save not only Israel, but the entire world. Isaiah's vision of the future includes the suffering servant, a mysterious figure who will bear the sins of many, and a glimpse of a new heaven and new earth, where God's justice and peace will reign forever. As we move through Isaiah's prophecies, we witness the tension between judgment and grace, between the immediate consequences of sin and the eternal plan for redemption. Isaiah's prophetic career begins with a dramatic vision of God's majesty and holiness in the heavenly temple. In Isaiah 6, Isaiah recounts how he saw the Lord high and lifted up, with seraphim flying around him, crying out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." This overwhelming vision of God's holiness causes Isaiah to cry out in despair, realizing his own sinfulness and the sin of his people. But in this moment, a seraph touches his lips with a burning coal, symbolizing the cleansing of his sin. This encounter with the Holy One sets the stage for Isaiah's prophetic mission. He is commissioned by God to speak to a rebellious people who will not listen, to proclaim judgment, but also to plant seeds of hope for future restoration. Isaiah's encounter with God reveals that true change begins with a vision of God's holiness, a holiness that not only judges sin, but also purifies and redeems. Much of Isaiah's early ministry is focused on delivering warnings of judgment, both to Israel and the surrounding nations. God's people have turned away from him, embracing idolatry, injustice, and reliance on foreign powers for protection instead of trusting in God. Isaiah warns that the northern kingdom of Israel will fall to the Assyrians, and later that Judah will face a similar fate if they do not repent. In Isaiah 1, he describes the spiritual state of the nation. The whole head is sick, the whole heart faint. Isaiah also prophesies against the nations surrounding Israel, such as Babylon, Moab, Edom, and Egypt, declaring that God's justice will extend to the entire world. He makes it clear that no nation is exempt from God's judgment, and all human pride will be brought low before the Almighty. Yet, amid these prophecies of destruction, Isaiah repeatedly offers glimpses of hope. He speaks of a remnant, a faithful few who will survive the coming judgments, and through whom God will bring restoration. This theme of judgment followed by hope weaves throughout the book, reflecting the nature of God's justice and mercy. As Isaiah looks to the future, one of his most powerful and enduring prophecies is the promise of a Messiah, a Savior who will redeem Israel and bring peace to the world. In Isaiah 9, he proclaims, For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This coming king will establish a kingdom of righteousness where justice and peace will reign forever. Isaiah's prophecies about the Messiah grow more detailed and profound as the book progresses. In Isaiah 11, he describes a branch from the stump of Jesse, David's father, who will judge with righteousness and usher in an era where even the wolf will lie down with the lamb, a vision of ultimate peace and harmony in creation. One of the most striking and mysterious parts of Isaiah's prophecy is the revelation of the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. This servant is described as one who is despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Yet, it is through his suffering that salvation comes. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. This prophecy points forward to Jesus Christ, who would come as the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan to redeem humanity through the cross. The suffering servant represents the paradox of Isaiah's message. The Messiah will not only reign in power, but will also suffer on behalf of his people, bearing their sins and bringing them peace through his own sacrifice. This vision of the servant offers hope not just for Israel, but for all people, as God's redemption reaches the ends of the earth. The book of Isaiah concludes with a stunning vision of the new heaven and new earth in Isaiah 65-66. Here, the prophet looks beyond the immediate future to the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan. In this new creation, God will dwell with his people, and the former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. Death, pain, and sorrow will be no more, and God's people will enjoy eternal peace in his presence. This final vision serves as a powerful reminder that despite the darkness of the present, God's future is filled with hope and glory. Isaiah paints a picture of a world fully restored, where righteousness dwells and God's reign is fully realized. It is a vision that inspires hope even in the bleakest of circumstances. The book of Isaiah is a rich tapestry of prophecy, offering both warnings of judgment and a vision of future hope. Isaiah's message was not only for his time, but speaks powerfully to all generations, calling us to recognize God's holiness, to repent of our sins, and to place our hope in the coming Messiah. Through Isaiah's eyes, we see the full scope of God's plan, from the present reality of judgment to the glorious future of restoration in a new heaven and new earth. Isaiah's prophecies point directly to Jesus Christ, the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise, who would come as both the righteous king and the suffering servant. In a world filled with uncertainty and injustice, Isaiah's vision reminds us that God's plan is unfolding, and his justice, mercy, and love will prevail.
The book of Jeremiah. With tears in his eyes, a prophet stands at the city gates, warning a stubborn people that judgment is coming. But even in judgment, there is a glimmer of hope. For God's mercy endures, and one day he will write his law on their hearts. Following the majestic visions of hope and redemption in Isaiah, the book of Jeremiah confronts us with a far more somber reality. Jeremiah's time is one of imminent catastrophe, as the warnings of earlier prophets begin to materialize. Jeremiah, often called the weeping prophet, is tasked with delivering a message of judgment to a people who have turned their backs on God. But even as he watches his beloved Jerusalem fall, he continues to speak of hope, a new covenant that will restore the broken relationship between God and his people. Jeremiah is one of the most emotional and personal prophetic books of the Bible. Known as the weeping prophet, Jeremiah's heart breaks over the persistent rebellion of his people. His message is urgent and dire. Jerusalem is on the brink of destruction, and the only way to avoid disaster is for the people of Judah to repent and return to God. But the people refuse to listen. As a result, Jeremiah witnesses the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, the destruction of the temple, and the exile of his people. Jeremiah's prophecies are full of warnings. He speaks of the certainty of judgment as Babylon rises and Judah falls. Yet, in the midst of his tears, there is a persistent hope. He speaks of a new covenant that God will make with his people, one that is written on their hearts rather than on stone. Even in the darkest of times, Jeremiah's words remind us that God's mercy endures, and his plans for restoration are never far away. The book begins with Jeremiah's call to be a prophet, which happens when he is just a young man. In Jeremiah 1, God tells him, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." Despite his initial hesitance, Jeremiah is chosen by God to deliver a difficult and unpopular message. From the very beginning, Jeremiah knows his task will not be easy. God warns him that the people will not listen to him and that he will face rejection, persecution, and suffering. Yet God also promises to be with him. "Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you." Jeremiah 1:8. This sets the tone for Jeremiah's entire ministry, a life marked by both personal anguish and unwavering faithfulness to God's calling. Much of Jeremiah's prophetic work revolves around warning Judah of its impending destruction. The people have turned to idolatry, corruption, and injustice, and God's patience is running out. In vivid images, Jeremiah describes the judgment that is coming. Jerusalem will be surrounded by enemies, the temple will be destroyed, and the people will be taken into exile. In Jeremiah 7, often called the Temple Sermon, Jeremiah stands at the gates of the temple and warns the people that their false sense of security in the temple will not save them from God's judgment. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, "This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord." Jeremiah's message is clear. Religious rituals and traditions cannot protect them if their hearts are far from God. The book also contains prophecies against other nations, but the focus remains on Judah's unfaithfulness and the consequences of their disobedience. Jeremiah's prophetic ministry was not without personal cost. He faced intense persecution from the very people he was trying to save. He was mocked, beaten, and even thrown into a cistern to die. In Jeremiah 38, his enemies seek to silence him by throwing him into a pit of mud, but he is rescued by a foreigner named Ebed-Melech, highlighting how even the foreign nations sometimes responded to God's word better than Judah. Throughout the book, Jeremiah wrestles with his calling. He is known for his confessions, in which he pours out his heart to God, questioning why he must endure so much suffering. In Jeremiah 20, he laments, "Cursed be the day I was born." Yet, despite his anguish, Jeremiah remains faithful to his mission, continuing to warn the people of God's impending judgment, even though he knows they will not listen. Eventually, Jeremiah's warnings come true. In Jeremiah 39, the Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, lay siege to Jerusalem. The city is destroyed, the temple is burned, and many of the people are taken into exile. Jeremiah witnesses the fulfillment of the prophecies he had been proclaiming for years, and it is a moment of deep sorrow and grief. Even after the fall of Jerusalem, Jeremiah remains with the people, continuing to offer God's guidance. But the destruction of the city marks a turning point in his message. Judgment has come, but the promise of restoration still remains. Amid the messages of destruction and judgment, Jeremiah offers one of the most profound promises in the Old Testament, the New Covenant. In Jeremiah 31:31-34, God promises that one day he will make a new covenant with his people. "I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." Unlike the Old Covenant, which was based on external laws, this new covenant will be internal, written on the hearts of the people. This promise of a new relationship between God and his people points forward to the coming of Jesus Christ, who would establish the new covenant through his death and resurrection. Jeremiah's message of hope assures the people that despite their present suffering, God has not abandoned them, and He will one day restore them. The Book of Lamentations. Amid the ashes of a ruined city, voices cry out in sorrow, yet there is a faint whisper of hope. Great is your faithfulness. In the darkest of days, the people of God cling to the belief that His mercy can bring restoration to even the most shattered of lives. The Book of Lamentations picks up where Jeremiah's heart-wrenching prophecies left off. Now, the warnings have come to pass. Jerusalem lies in ruins, the temple is destroyed, and the people have been taken into exile. Lamentations is a collection of 5 poetic laments that give voice to the sorrow, grief, and devastation of a people whose world has fallen apart. Yet, even amid the cries of despair, there is a flicker of hope, a reminder that God's faithfulness remains, even when all else seems lost. Lamentations is a deeply emotional and poetic expression of grief over the destruction of Jerusalem. The poems describe the suffering of the people, the desolation of the city, and the overwhelming sense of loss that followed the fall of Judah. The author, traditionally believed to be Jeremiah, pours out his sorrow, not only over the physical destruction, but also over the spiritual and moral collapse that led to it. The Book of Lamentations captures the weight of judgment, but it is not without hope. In the midst of profound grief, the author reflects on God's faithfulness and His ability to restore what has been lost. The famous words from Lamentations 3:22-23 declare, "Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning, great is your faithfulness." Lamentations reminds us that even in our darkest moments, God is still present, and His mercy is not far off. The opening chapter of Lamentations describes Jerusalem's desolation in vivid and heart-wrenching detail. The once great city, full of life and prosperity, now sits in silence, her gates broken, her people gone. How deserted lies the city once so full of people. Lamentations 1:1. The imagery of a widow mourning her loss is used to capture the profound sorrow of a city that has been utterly destroyed. The people of Jerusalem are portrayed as exiles, wandering in despair, suffering from hunger and humiliation. The pain of seeing their beloved temple desecrated and their homeland laid waste is almost unbearable, and the laments express this grief with raw emotion. Throughout Lamentations, there are vivid descriptions of the suffering that the people endured. The author speaks of children fainting in the streets, of women boiling their own children to survive, and of priests and elders perishing in the ruins of the city. The weight of the suffering is overwhelming, and the people cry out in their anguish, wondering if God has forgotten them. The laments are not just expressions of grief, but also prayers. The people cry out to God, acknowledging their sins and pleading for His mercy. The suffering is seen as a result of their rebellion, but there is also a desperate longing for restoration. Despite the overwhelming sorrow, there are moments in Lamentations where hope breaks through. In the midst of the lament in Lamentations 3, the author recalls God's faithfulness. "Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed." These words offer a glimpse of hope, even as the city lies in ruins. The poems shift between despair and hope, between sorrow and faith. The people recognize that God's judgment was just, but they also believe that His mercy can restore them. The final chapter is a plea for God to look upon their suffering and to bring them back from exile. "Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old." Lamentations 5:21. Jeremiah and Lamentations together form a powerful portrait of a nation in spiritual and physical collapse. Jeremiah's tears and warnings fall on deaf ears, and the judgment he foretold comes to pass in the destruction of Jerusalem. Yet, Both books remind us that even in the face of overwhelming loss, God's mercy and faithfulness remain. Jeremiah's promise of a new covenant and Lamentations' cries for restoration point forward to the hope that one day God will heal the brokenness and bring his people back to himself. The book of Ezekiel. In a foreign land, a prophet sees a vision of God's throne carried by living creatures and a valley of dry bones brought to life, proof that even in exile God's power and promise remain. Ezekiel's message is clear. Judgment may have come, but restoration is on the horizon, and God's glory will one day fill the earth once more. After the fall of Jerusalem and the intense sorrow expressed in Lamentations, God's people are in exile, scattered and broken. They've seen the destruction of their homeland and the temple, the very heart of their worship. But in this foreign land, far from the ruins of Jerusalem, God speaks again. Ezekiel, a prophet among the exiles, is given a series of breathtaking visions that reveal God's glory and power, even in exile. He sees that though judgment has fallen, God has not abandoned his people. There is hope for restoration, a new future in which Israel will be renewed and God's glory will once again fill the land. The book of Ezekiel is filled with stunning and often bewildering visions, powerful symbols and messages of both judgment and hope. Ezekiel, a prophet and priest, is among the Jewish exiles in Babylon, living in a time of great despair and confusion. Yet in this place of exile, God reveals his glory to Ezekiel in ways that are both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Through Ezekiel, God reminds the people that he is not confined to Jerusalem or the temple. His presence extends even into the lands of their captivity. Ezekiel's prophecies are divided between messages of judgment for Israel's sins and promises of future restoration. The judgment is harsh. Ezekiel speaks of Israel's idolatry, their spiritual unfaithfulness, and the certainty of continued suffering. But the latter part of the book offers a remarkable vision of restoration, where God promises to bring life to the dead and scattered nation, symbolized by the valley of dry bones. In Ezekiel's prophetic ministry, we see that even in the darkest times, God's plan is unfolding, and his glory will one day be fully revealed. The book of Ezekiel opens with one of the most extraordinary visions in the Bible. In Ezekiel 1, Ezekiel describes seeing the heavens opened and a vision of God's glory, a great storm wind, flashing lightning, and fire. In the midst of this storm are 4 living creatures, each with 4 faces, that of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, and 4 wings. Above them is a crystal-like expanse, and seated on a throne above this is the likeness of a figure who appears like a man, glowing with the radiance of fire. This vision of the chariot of God's glory reveals God's majesty and his sovereignty, even in the midst of the exile. It serves as a powerful reminder that God is not confined to the temple or Jerusalem. His glory moves freely, carried by the living creatures, and his rule extends over all nations, even in Babylon. Ezekiel's vision establishes the theme that God's presence and power remain with his people, even in the most unlikely of places. Much like Jeremiah, Ezekiel's early prophecies focus on the reasons for Israel's exile. He condemns their idolatry, their failure to follow God's laws, and their spiritual unfaithfulness. One of the most striking images Ezekiel uses is that of Israel as an unfaithful bride. God had rescued and adorned her, yet she turned to other lovers, idols, and abandoned her covenant with God. Ezekiel also uses vivid and sometimes shocking imagery to communicate the seriousness of Israel's sin. He symbolically acts out his prophecies, lying on one side for 390 days to represent Israel's years of sin and cooking food over cow dung to symbolize the defiled state of the people. These dramatic actions serve to underscore the gravity of Israel's rebellion and the certainty of judgment. Yet even in these harsh judgments, God's desire for repentance is clear. He says in Ezekiel 18:31, Rid yourselves of all the offenses you have committed, and get a new heart and a new spirit. Why will you die, people of Israel? God is calling his people to turn back to him, even as judgment looms. One of the most famous and hopeful passages in the book of Ezekiel is found in Ezekiel 37, where Ezekiel is taken to a valley filled with dry bones. In this vision, God asks Ezekiel, "Can these bones live?" Ezekiel responds, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." God then commands Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones, and as he does, the bones begin to rattle and come together. Flesh and skin cover them, and finally the breath of life enters them, and they stand as a vast army. This vision symbolizes the restoration of Israel. The dry bones represent the people of Israel, spiritually dead and scattered in exile. But God promises that he will breathe new life into them, gather them from the nations, and bring them back to their land. "I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land." Ezekiel 37:14. The Valley of Dry Bones is a powerful image of resurrection, not just physically, but spiritually. It points to God's power to restore what seems hopeless and dead. This vision offers hope to a people who feel cut off from God, reminding them that their story is not over. God has plans to revive and restore them. Throughout the latter part of Ezekiel's ministry, the focus shifts from judgment to restoration. God promises to give his people a new heart and a new spirit, transforming them from the inside out. In Ezekiel 36:26-27, God declares, "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws." This promise of inner transformation is a precursor to the new covenant, where God's Spirit will dwell within his people. Ezekiel also has an extended vision of a new temple in chapters 40-48. In this vision, Ezekiel sees a grand and perfect temple, a symbol of God's restored presence among his people. This future temple represents not just the rebuilding of the physical temple in Jerusalem, but the complete renewal of Israel's relationship with God. The final chapters of Ezekiel also include a vision of a river flowing from the temple, bringing life and healing to the land, symbolizing the restoration of creation under God's reign. The book of Ezekiel takes us on a journey from judgment to restoration, from the depths of despair in exile to the hope of new life and a new relationship with God. Ezekiel's visions are both awe-inspiring and comforting, reminding us that even in the darkest times, God's presence is with his people, and his plans for restoration are never far off. Ezekiel's message resonates deeply with anyone who has felt the weight of sin or the distance of exile. His vision of the Valley of Dry Bones serves as a powerful reminder that no situation is beyond God's power to restore. And his vision of the new temple points forward to the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to dwell with his people forever. In Ezekiel, we see that God's glory and grace are boundless, and his plan for his people is one of eternal life and restoration. The Book of Daniel. In the courts of kings and before the jaws of lions, a young man's faith never wavers. His dreams reveal kingdoms that will rise and fall, but only God's kingdom will last forever. The story of Daniel is one of courage in the face of danger, a testament to God's power and sovereignty over all earthly rulers and empires. As Ezekiel delivered prophecies among the exiles in Babylon, Daniel was living in the heart of the empire itself, serving in the royal court of Babylon. Despite being far from Jerusalem and surrounded by a pagan culture, Daniel and his friends remained faithful to God in ways that inspired generations to come. The book of Daniel tells the story of remarkable faith under pressure, miraculous deliverance, and prophetic visions that unveil the future course of world history. In Daniel's life and visions, we see that God's sovereignty transcends all earthly kingdoms, and his power sustains those who trust him, even in the most dangerous situations. The book of Daniel is a narrative of courage and conviction, interwoven with apocalyptic visions that reveal God's control over the rise and fall of empires. Daniel, a young Jewish exile, is taken to Babylon and placed in the service of King Nebuchadnezzar. Despite being immersed in a foreign culture, Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, remain unwavering in their devotion to God, even when their lives are threatened by fiery furnaces, lions' dens, and royal decrees. In the first half of the book, we witness Daniel and his friends' heroic stand for their faith, while the second half focuses on Daniel's prophetic visions, which foretell the future of world kingdoms and the ultimate establishment of God's eternal kingdom. Daniel's story serves as a powerful example of how faith can thrive in hostile environments, and how God is faithful to those who stand firm in their devotion to Him. Early in their exile, Daniel and his friends are placed in positions of influence within the Babylonian Empire. However, when King Nebuchadnezzar erects a golden image and commands everyone to bow down and worship it, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse, declaring that they will not worship any god but the God of Israel. Their refusal enrages the king, and they are thrown into a blazing, fiery furnace as punishment. Yet, in one of the most dramatic moments in the Bible, the king looks into the furnace and sees not 3 men, but 4, unharmed, and walking in the flames. The 4th figure, described as looking like a son of the gods, is believed to be a divine presence protecting them. When the men are brought out, not even their clothes are singed. Their faith in God, regardless of whether He would deliver them, becomes a powerful testimony to the king and to all who witness this miracle. As Daniel serves in Nebuchadnezzar's court, the king is troubled by a series of dreams that no one can interpret. In Daniel 2, God grants Daniel the wisdom to interpret the king's dream, which involves a great statue made of various metals, each representing successive world empires. The statue is ultimately destroyed by a stone that grows into a mountain, symbolizing the eternal kingdom of God. Daniel reveals that the kingdoms of this world, symbolized by gold, silver, bronze, and iron, will rise and fall, but God's kingdom will endure forever. This prophetic message becomes a central theme in Daniel's visions, that no matter how powerful the earthly kingdoms seem, they are temporary compared to the everlasting reign of God. In Daniel 5, we find the famous account of Belshazzar's feast, where the Babylonian king arrogantly uses the sacred vessels from the temple in Jerusalem to drink wine and praise the gods of gold and silver. During the banquet, a mysterious hand appears and writes on the wall, "Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin." Belshazzar is terrified and calls for Daniel to interpret the writing. Daniel reveals that the message is a divine judgment against Belshazzar and his kingdom. Mene means that God has numbered the days of Belshazzar's reign. Tekel means he has been weighed and found wanting, and Parsin means his kingdom will be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, Belshazzar is killed, and the mighty Babylonian Empire falls, just as God had foretold. Under the reign of Darius, Daniel's faith is once again tested. Despite a royal decree forbidding prayer to anyone but the king, Daniel continues his daily practice of praying to the God of Israel. His enemies, jealous of his position and influence, use this as a trap to have him thrown into the lion's den. In one of the most famous stories in the Bible, Daniel is cast into the den of lions as punishment for his faithfulness to God. Yet just as he had saved Daniel's friends from the fire, God sends an angel to shut the mouths of the lions. When the king rushes to the den the next morning, he finds Daniel unharmed. This miraculous deliverance leads King Darius to declare that the God of Daniel is the living God, and he endures forever. Daniel 6:26. Daniel's faithfulness, even in the face of certain death, demonstrates the power of trust in God. His deliverance from the lions becomes a symbol of God's ability to protect his people, no matter the circumstances. The second half of the book of Daniel focuses on a series of apocalyptic visions that reveal the rise and fall of future empires and the ultimate establishment of God's kingdom. In Daniel 7, Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts, symbolizing 4 great kingdoms that will dominate the earth. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, Daniel sees one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, who is given eternal dominion and authority over all peoples and nations. This vision, along with others in the latter chapters of the book, points to the coming of God's kingdom and the defeat of the forces of evil. These prophetic visions offer hope to the exiles and to all believers that God's reign will be victorious, and that he alone holds the future in his hands. The book of Daniel offers an inspiring and vivid account of faith in action, even in the most hostile environments. Daniel and his friends remain faithful to God in the face of fiery furnaces, lions' dens, and the temptations of power and influence in a foreign land. Their story shows that no matter the pressures we face, God is with those who trust in him and will deliver them, whether in life or in death. Daniel's prophetic visions remind us that while the kingdoms of this world rise and fall, God's kingdom is eternal and unshakable. The courage of Daniel and his friends, coupled with the prophetic revelation of God's future kingdom, points us toward the ultimate hope that transcends all earthly powers, the coming reign of Christ, the Son of Man, whose kingdom will never end. The Book of Hosea. A prophet's broken heart mirrors God's own, as he loves a people who run from him. Yet even in their betrayal, he promises that love will win in the end, offering restoration where there was once ruin. Hosea's life and marriage serve as a living parable of God's unfailing love for Israel, despite their persistent unfaithfulness. Through his marriage to Gomer, an unfaithful wife, Hosea embodies God's heartache as his people chase after idols. Yet, in the face of betrayal, God promises to restore Israel, offering love even when it is undeserved. A dark swarm of locusts blackens the sky, a symbol of imminent destruction. Yet amidst the shadow of judgment, a promise gleams. One day, God's Spirit will pour out on all people, bringing restoration and new life to the land. Joel issues a stark warning to Israel, using a devastating plague of locusts as a metaphor for the impending judgment that awaits those who do not turn back to God. His prophecy, however, does not end in despair. Joel speaks of hope, foretelling a future when God's Spirit will be poured out on all people, heralding the arrival of the day of the Lord, a time of both judgment and renewal. The Book of Amos. A simple shepherd thunders against the powerful, crying out for justice in the streets, reminding a complacent people that God's righteousness demands action. Amos's call for justice still echoes today. Let it roll down like waters, and let righteousness flow like an unstoppable stream. Following the prophetic warnings in Joel about the coming day of the Lord, Amos steps onto the scene as an unexpected voice of God's justice. Amos is not a professional prophet or a priest, but a simple shepherd and fig farmer from the southern kingdom of Judah. Yet God calls him to deliver a bold message of judgment to the northern kingdom of Israel, whose wealth and complacency have led them far from God's commandments. Amos's message is one of justice and righteousness, a call to return to the heart of God's law, a law that demands care for the oppressed and a rejection of hypocrisy and idolatry. The Book of Amos is a fiery and uncompromising call to social justice. While Israel enjoys a period of economic prosperity and political stability under King Jeroboam II, Amos exposes the corruption, injustice, and spiritual complacency lurking beneath the surface. The wealthy oppress the poor, the judges take bribes, and the people worship idols while claiming to honor God. Amos is tasked with delivering a message that the people of Israel are not living in alignment with God's expectations. He warns that their mistreatment of the vulnerable and their empty religious practices will bring about God's judgment. Amos's famous words in Amos 5:24 ring out as a rallying cry for justice. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. His message is clear. God is not impressed by religious rituals or wealth if the hearts of the people are far from him, and if their society is built on injustice. Amos begins by pronouncing judgment not just on Israel, but on the surrounding nations. However, he quickly turns his focus to Israel's own sins. The people of Israel are guilty of exploiting the poor and vulnerable, engaging in corrupt business practices, and taking advantage of the weak. Amos 2:6-7 condemns them for selling the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground and deny justice to the oppressed. Despite their outward religious observances, Israel's heart is far from God. Their festivals and sacrifices mean nothing if they are not accompanied by justice and mercy. Amos calls them out for their hypocrisy, warning that God desires true righteousness, not empty rituals. Amos is given a series of visions that illustrate the impending judgment on Israel. In one vision, God shows Amos a plumb line, a tool used to measure whether a structure is straight. The plumb line symbolizes God's standard of righteousness, and Israel is found to be crooked and out of alignment with his law. In another vision, Amos sees a basket of ripe fruit, symbolizing that Israel's time of judgment is ripe. God's patience has run out. These visions serve as powerful metaphors for the moral decay of Israel and the certainty of their impending destruction if they do not repent. Amos repeatedly warns that their false sense of security and their wealth will not save them from God's judgment. One of the most memorable moments in Amos's prophecy is his passionate plea for justice and righteousness. In Amos 5:21-24, God declares that he despises Israel's religious festivals and offerings because they are empty gestures, disconnected from true devotion to his ways. God is not interested in outward displays of worship if they are not accompanied by lives of justice. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This verse has become a timeless call for justice, a reminder that God's people are called to reflect his heart by caring for the oppressed, the poor, and the marginalized. Amos's message is clear. True worship of God is inseparable from a life of righteousness and justice. Although the bulk of Amos's message is one of judgment, the book ends with a note of hope. In the final verses, God promises to restore the fallen house of David and to bring about a time of abundance and blessing. Israel's sins will lead to destruction, but God's mercy will ultimately prevail. The promise of restoration points forward to a future time when God will heal the land and re-establish his people in righteousness. This final promise reminds us that while God's justice is real and his judgment certain, his heart is always bent toward restoration and redemption. Obadiah, the fall of Edom. In a few short verses, a prophet speaks doom to a proud nation, reminding the world that no kingdom can stand when it exalts itself above God. Edom's betrayal of their brother nation brings swift judgment, but the promise of restoration remains for God's people. While Amos called for justice within Israel, the book of Obadiah turns its focus to the nation of Edom, Israel's ancient rival and brother nation. The Edomites, descendants of Esau, stood by and even rejoiced when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. Now, in just a few short verses, Obadiah delivers a devastating judgment against Edom, declaring that their pride and treachery will lead to their downfall. Though it is the shortest book in the Old Testament, Obadiah packs a powerful message. No nation, no matter how secure or proud, can stand against God's judgment. The book of Obadiah is a brief but intense prophecy against the nation of Edom, which had a long and bitter history with Israel. The Edomites were descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob, and their rivalry with Israel mirrored the conflict between Esau and Jacob. When the Babylonians attacked Jerusalem, Edom not only failed to come to Israel's aid, but also rejoiced over their downfall, looted the city, and even captured fleeing Israelites to hand them over to the enemy. This betrayal, rooted in long-standing animosity, would not go unpunished. Obadiah's prophecy focuses on the judgment of Edom for their arrogance and treachery. While they took pride in their seemingly impregnable mountain fortresses, Obadiah warns that their destruction is imminent. Edom's fate serves as a warning to all nations that God will not tolerate pride, betrayal, or injustice, and that he is sovereign over all the earth. The central theme of Obadiah's prophecy is the judgment of Edom for their arrogance and betrayal of Israel. Edom had taken advantage of Jerusalem's fall, believing they were safe in their mountain strongholds. The pride of your heart has deceived you, Obadiah warns. You who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights, you say to yourself, "Who can bring me down to the ground?" Obadiah 1:3. But God declares that no fortress is high enough to escape his judgment. Edom's arrogance, cruelty, and betrayal of their brother nation will lead to their downfall. God's justice will be swift and certain, and their lofty positions will not protect them from his wrath. While the immediate focus of Obadiah's prophecy is Edom, the broader message extends to all nations. Obadiah speaks of the day of the Lord, a time when God will bring justice to all the nations of the earth. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. Obadiah 1:15. This principle of divine justice underscores the idea that no nation can escape accountability before God. The day of the Lord is not just about Israel's enemies. It is about the universal truth that God's justice will one day be established over all the earth, and every act of betrayal, pride, and injustice will be judged. While Edom faces destruction, the book of Obadiah ends with a promise of Israel's restoration. In the final verses, Obadiah prophesies that Israel will one day possess the land of Edom and reclaim the territory that was lost. But on Mount Zion will be deliverance. It will be holy, and Jacob will possess his inheritance. Obadiah 1:17. This promise of restoration echoes the broader theme of hope found throughout the prophets. While God's judgment is real, his ultimate plan is one of redemption and restoration for his people. The kingdom will be the Lord's. Obadiah 1:21, signaling the future reign of God over all nations and the vindication of his people. The messages of Amos and Obadiah speak powerfully about God's justice. Amos confronts Israel's social injustice and hypocrisy, calling for repentance and a return to righteousness. His bold call for justice, "Let justice roll down like waters," resonates with anyone who longs to see fairness and righteousness in a world plagued by corruption. Obadiah, on the other hand, delivers a stark warning to Edom and to all nations who trust in their own strength and betray their neighbors. Both books remind us that God's justice will prevail, and that no amount of wealth, power, or pride can stand against his righteous judgment. In these prophetic words, we see the heart of God, a heart that longs for justice, righteousness, and the restoration of his people. While judgment may fall, God's ultimate plan is always one of hope and redemption for those who turn to him. The Book of Jonah, the reluctant prophet. A prophet runs from his calling only to find that God's mercy is relentless, even for the most unexpected people. Jonah's story challenges us to see that God's compassion extends beyond our boundaries, offering grace to all who turn to him, no matter how far they've strayed. After hearing the stark warning of judgment in Obadiah, we turn to the story of Jonah, a prophet who wrestles with God's mercy. Unlike many of the other prophets, Jonah's struggle is not with the people he's sent to prophesy against, but with God's willingness to forgive those who repent. Jonah is called to preach to Nineveh, the capital of the brutal Assyrian Empire, Israel's bitter enemy. Yet instead of obeying, Jonah runs in the opposite direction. What follows is a story of divine pursuit, repentance, and a surprising twist of mercy that Jonah finds hard to accept. The book of Jonah is a unique narrative in the prophetic books, focusing on the prophet himself rather than solely on the message he delivers. Jonah is called by God to go to Nineveh, a great city notorious for its wickedness, and proclaim judgment unless they repent. But Jonah, knowing God's character of mercy, flees in the opposite direction, boarding a ship headed for Tarshish. His attempt to escape his mission is thwarted by a storm sent by God, and Jonah is thrown overboard and swallowed by a great fish. In the belly of the fish, Jonah prays to God and is delivered, ultimately completing his mission. When Nineveh repents, Jonah becomes angry, revealing his reluctance was not fear of failure but fear of success. He didn't want God to show mercy to such a wicked people. Through Jonah's story, we see that God's mercy extends to all people, even those we might think are undeserving. The book begins with God calling Jonah to preach to Nineveh. Instead of obeying, Jonah flees in the opposite direction, boarding a ship to Tarshish. Jonah's flight is a symbolic rejection of God's plan and an attempt to avoid the possibility of Nineveh's repentance. He would rather see the city destroyed than see them receive God's mercy. However, God sends a violent storm that threatens to sink the ship. The sailors, realizing that Jonah is the cause of the storm, throw him overboard, and the storm immediately calms. Jonah's attempt to run from God is met with divine intervention, showing that no one can outrun God's call. As Jonah sinks into the sea, he is swallowed by a great fish that God sends to save him. Inside the fish, Jonah prays a prayer of thanksgiving and repentance, acknowledging that God is his only source of salvation. After 3 days, the fish vomits Jonah onto dry land, giving him a second chance to fulfill his mission. Jonah's time in the belly of the fish is a moment of reflection and transformation. His prayer shows that even in the depths of despair, God is there to hear and deliver. The great fish becomes a symbol of God's ability to provide rescue even when we have brought trouble upon ourselves. Jonah finally goes to Nineveh and delivers a simple message: 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. To Jonah's dismay, the people of Nineveh immediately repent. From the king to the commoners, they fast, wear sackcloth, and cry out to God for mercy. God, seeing their repentance, spares the city. This moment of repentance is astonishing. Nineveh, known for its cruelty and wickedness, responds to Jonah's warning with humility. The city's collective repentance demonstrates the transformative power of God's word, even in the hearts of those who seem farthest from him. God's mercy is extended to the most unlikely recipients, revealing his desire for all people to turn from sin and live. Instead of rejoicing over Nineveh's repentance, Jonah becomes angry. He tells God that he fled in the first place because he knew God would be merciful. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Jonah 4:2. Jonah is upset because he believes that Nineveh deserves judgment, not forgiveness. God responds by gently teaching Jonah a lesson through a plant that provides him shade. When the plant withers and Jonah is upset, God asks him why he cares more about a plant than the lives of the people of Nineveh. Should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left? Jonah 4:11. The book ends on this open-ended question, leaving the reader to wrestle with the scope of God's mercy. The book of Micah. In the midst of corruption, a prophet speaks of a future ruler born in Bethlehem and calls God's people back to the simple truth: do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Micah's message cuts through the noise, reminding us that God's heart is always for justice and humility. As Jonah wrestles with God's mercy toward a foreign city, the prophet Micah turns his attention back to the injustices happening within Israel itself. Like Jonah, Micah speaks of God's judgment, but his focus is on the leaders and people of Israel who have abandoned God's ways. While corruption and idolatry run rampant, Micah's message cuts to the core of what it means to live in covenant with God. It's not about religious rituals or sacrifices, but about justice, mercy, and humility. At the same time, Micah looks forward to the coming of a Messiah from Bethlehem, who will one day restore justice and peace to the world. The book of Micah alternates between messages of judgment and hope, with Micah delivering a scathing critique of Israel's leaders for their injustice, oppression, and idolatry. The rulers, prophets, and priests have exploited the poor and led the people astray, and Micah declares that God's judgment will come upon them. Yet woven through these warnings is a promise of restoration, a future ruler from Bethlehem who will shepherd God's people and bring lasting peace. Micah's famous statement in Micah 6:8 captures the heart of his message. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. This is the essence of the covenant relationship that God desires with his people. Micah calls Israel back to these foundational values, pointing them toward a future where justice and righteousness will prevail. Micah's message is directed primarily at the leaders of Israel, the rulers, prophets, and priests, who have corrupted justice and led the people into sin. He denounces the wealthy for exploiting the poor and using their power for personal gain. In Micah 3:11, he declares, "Her leaders judge for a bribe, her priests teach for a price, and her prophets tell fortunes for money." These leaders have turned justice into a commodity, and their greed has led the nation astray. Micah warns that because of their corruption, Jerusalem will be destroyed, and the temple will become a heap of ruins. His message is clear. When those in power pervert justice and oppress the vulnerable, they invite God's judgment upon the entire nation. Amid the warnings of judgment, Micah offers one of the most beautiful prophecies of the coming Messiah. In Micah 5:2, he foretells the birth of a ruler from Bethlehem, a seemingly insignificant town. "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." This prophecy points forward to the birth of Jesus Christ, the humble king who would come from Bethlehem to shepherd God's people. Micah envisions a future where this ruler will bring justice, peace, and righteousness, a stark contrast to the corrupt leaders of his own time. One of the most memorable moments in Micah's prophecy comes in Micah 6, where God challenges the people to remember what he truly desires from them. The people ask if they can appease God with burnt offerings or rivers of oil, but Micah responds with a simple and profound truth. "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." Micah 6, verse 8. This verse captures the essence of Micah's message. God is not interested in empty religious rituals or outward displays of piety. What he desires is a life marked by justice, kindness, and humility, a life that reflects his own character. Micah's words resonate through the ages, reminding God's people that true faith is lived out in how we treat others and how we walk with God. Despite the dark warnings of judgment, Micah also offers a vision of a future where justice and peace will reign. In Micah 4, he describes a time when they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. This prophetic vision speaks of a world where God's reign brings an end to violence and injustice, and where peace and righteousness flourish. Micah's vision of restoration points to the coming kingdom of God, where the Messiah will rule with justice, and the brokenness of the world will be healed. It is a message of hope that reminds us that God's ultimate plan is one of redemption and renewal. Jonah and Micah offer two powerful prophetic messages, one focused on the mercy of God and the other on the justice of God. Jonah's story challenges our assumptions about who deserves God's mercy, showing that his love extends to all people, even those we might consider enemies. Micah, on the other hand, calls out the injustices within Israel, reminding the people that true faith is not about outward rituals, but about living justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God. Together, these books remind us that God's character is both just and merciful, and He calls His people to reflect that character in their lives and in their communities. Whether calling for repentance or offering a vision of hope, the prophets Jonah and Micah teach us that God's ways are higher than ours, and His love is greater than we can imagine. The Book of Nahum, the Fall of Nineveh. The once mighty city of Nineveh, which had terrorized nations, now faces its own downfall, reminding the world that God's justice will always prevail. In the end, no power is greater than the power of God's righteousness, and no evil can stand forever before His judgment. The book of Jonah ended with God showing mercy to the city of Nineveh when they repented. However, generations later, the city returned to its wicked ways, becoming a symbol of cruelty and violence as the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians, notorious for their brutality, had terrorized nations, including Israel. Now, through the prophet Nahum, God announces the inevitable judgment upon Nineveh. Nahum's prophecy is a stark reminder that while God is patient, His justice will not be delayed forever. The book of Nahum focuses on the imminent destruction of Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and the certainty of God's justice. Nineveh, which had once repented at Jonah's preaching, has since returned to its former evil ways, oppressing the nations around it with cruelty and violence. Nahum's prophecy declares that Nineveh's time is up. God's judgment will come swiftly and completely. The fall of Nineveh would signify not just the downfall of a city, but the end of an empire that had long terrorized Israel and its neighbors. Nahum's message is one of divine justice. While Nineveh had enjoyed prosperity and power, it had done so at the expense of others, using fear and force to dominate. Now, God's justice will come down upon them like a flood, showing that no empire, no matter how mighty, can escape accountability. Through Nahum's words, we see that God's justice is inevitable, and He will not allow evil to go unpunished forever. Nahum vividly describes the coming destruction of Nineveh with imagery of overwhelming force. In Nahum 1, God is described as a jealous and avenging God, slow to anger but powerful in His wrath. The prophecy speaks of floodwaters and fire, forces of nature that will sweep through the city, signaling its total devastation. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble, Nahum declares, but with an overwhelming flood, He will make an end of Nineveh. Nahum 1:7-8. Nahum's description of Nineveh's fall is both terrifying and certain. The city's mighty walls and defenses will not be able to save it from the judgment of God. The once feared empire will be brought to its knees, and its defeat will be a cause for celebration for the nations that suffered under its oppression. While the prophecy of Nineveh's destruction is dire for the Assyrians, it is a message of hope and deliverance for the nations that have been oppressed by their cruelty, especially Israel. Nahum portrays God as a warrior king who fights for His people, bringing justice to those who have been wronged. Behold, upon the mountains, the feet of Him who brings good news, who publishes peace. Nahum 1:15. The fall of Nineveh is not just a victory over a wicked city, it is the triumph of God's justice over evil. Nahum's prophecy reminds us that God sees the suffering of the oppressed, and though justice may seem delayed, it will come in God's perfect timing. Nineveh's downfall serves as a warning to all who exalt themselves through violence and oppression. God's justice will always prevail. The Book of Habakkuk. A prophet cries out, "Why, God? and receives an answer that shakes him to the core, teaching us to trust in God's goodness even when life makes no sense. In a world full of confusion and chaos, Habakkuk's journey reminds us that faith is about trusting in the unseen and waiting patiently for God's justice. While Nahum confidently declares the coming judgment on Nineveh, the prophet Habakkuk takes a different approach. Rather than proclaiming judgment, Habakkuk begins with a question, a deep and anguished cry for understanding. Living in a time when violence, corruption, and injustice seem to reign unchecked, Habakkuk struggles to reconcile God's holiness with the evil he sees around him. Unlike other prophets, Habakkuk doesn't just deliver a message from God, he engages in a dialogue with God, seeking answers to some of life's most troubling questions. The book of Habakkuk is unique in that it is less of a proclamation and more of a conversation between a prophet and God. Habakkuk's opening cry is one of frustration and confusion. "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save?" Habakkuk 1:2. He is troubled by the wickedness he sees among his own people, and even more disturbed when God reveals that he will use the Babylonians, a people even more wicked than Israel, to bring judgment. Through this dialogue, Habakkuk wrestles with the age-old question of why God allows evil to thrive and why the righteous suffer. Yet, by the end of the book, Habakkuk moves from confusion to trust, realizing that God's ways are higher than our ways, and his justice, though sometimes delayed, is certain. Habakkuk's final declaration of faith, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior," Habakkuk 3:18, serves as a powerful testament to trusting God, even when his plans are beyond our understanding. The book opens with Habakkuk's lament, questioning why God seems to be silent and inactive in the face of injustice. "Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing?" Habakkuk 1:3. Habakkuk is deeply troubled by the moral decay and violence he sees in Judah and demands to know why God is not intervening. When God responds, he reveals that he is raising up the Babylonians to bring judgment on Judah. This answer shocks Habakkuk, who cannot understand why God would use such a cruel and evil nation as his instrument of justice. "Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous?" Habakkuk 1:13. Habakkuk's complaint reflects the tension many of us feel when God's actions, or inactions, seem incomprehensible. In response to Habakkuk's second complaint, God reassures him that while the Babylonians may be used as an instrument of judgment, they too will face justice in due time. God's plan is unfolding on a larger scale than Habakkuk can see, and though it may seem delayed, the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Habakkuk 2:4. This famous verse emphasizes that, in times of uncertainty, the faithful must live by trusting in God's ultimate justice, even when the world seems chaotic. God's answer includes a series of woes against the Babylonians, condemning their violence, greed, and idolatry. Their moment of power will be short-lived, and their destruction is assured. Through this, God reminds Habakkuk and the reader that evil will not go unpunished forever, and God's justice will come at the appointed time. In the final chapter, Habakkuk offers a prayer that reflects his journey from confusion to trust. He recalls the mighty works of God in the past, remembering how God had delivered his people and displayed his power. Although Habakkuk knows that difficult times are ahead, he chooses to place his trust in God's sovereignty. The closing verses of Habakkuk's prayer are a profound statement of faith. "Though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior." Habakkuk 3:17-18. This declaration, made in the face of impending disaster, shows that Habakkuk has learned to trust in God's goodness even when life makes no sense. His faith is not dependent on circumstances but rooted in the knowledge that God is sovereign and just. Nahum and Habakkuk together paint a vivid picture of God's justice and the complexities of faith. Nahum celebrates the fall of Nineveh, the oppressor of nations, and serves as a reminder that no empire is too powerful to escape God's judgment. His prophecy reassures the oppressed that God's justice will prevail even when it seems delayed. Habakkuk, on the other hand, shows us a more personal struggle. A prophet wrestling with God's plan, questioning why evil is allowed to thrive, and ultimately learning to trust in God's sovereignty. Through Habakkuk's journey, we are reminded that faith does not always come with easy answers, but it calls us to trust God's wisdom, even in the midst of confusion. Both books emphasize that God's justice is inevitable, but His timing is perfect, even when it confounds human understanding. While judgment may come, so does restoration, and through it all, God's righteousness stands firm. The Book of Zephaniah. A dark day of judgment is coming, but after the storm, a new dawn will break for those who remain faithful. In the end, God's love will triumph, and He will sing over His people with joy, reminding them that His justice and mercy go hand in hand. After Habakkuk's personal wrestling with God's justice, we now turn to Zephaniah, who delivers a more collective and widespread message of judgment. Zephaniah's focus is on the day of the Lord, a time of reckoning not just for Israel, but for all nations. Yet, as with many of the prophets, the looming judgment is tempered with a promise of restoration for the faithful. Zephaniah's prophecy reflects the dual nature of the day of the Lord, both a day of darkness and a day of hope for those who turn back to God. The book of Zephaniah is a powerful warning of the coming day of the Lord, a day of divine judgment that will sweep through Judah, Jerusalem, and the surrounding nations. Zephaniah warns of a devastating judgment due to the rampant idolatry, corruption, and moral decay of the people. God's wrath will be poured out, and no one will escape. Zephaniah's language is intense, portraying the day as a time of great terror, a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of darkness and gloom. Zephaniah 1:15. Yet Zephaniah also offers hope. After the storm of judgment, God promises a future restoration for the faithful remnant who turn to Him. The prophet speaks of a time when God will purify His people, remove their shame, and restore them to a place of honor and joy. Zephaniah 3:17 gives a glimpse of this glorious future. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In His love He will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing. This promise of God's presence and delight underscores that judgment is not the final word. God's mercy will triumph for those who remain faithful. Zephaniah begins his prophecy with a chilling declaration of impending judgment. I will sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. Zephaniah 1:2. The judgment is aimed at both Judah and the nations surrounding them. The people of Judah have turned to idolatry, worshiping foreign gods, and have become complacent in their sin. Zephaniah describes a terrifying day of the Lord that will bring total destruction to the land, a day when God's wrath will consume everything in its path. This judgment is not limited to Israel alone, but extends to the nations that have oppressed or led Israel astray, including Philistia, Moab, Ammon, and Assyria. Zephaniah's prophecy reminds the people that God's justice is universal, and no nation can escape His judgment. Despite the dire warnings, Zephaniah offers a call to repentance. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the land, you who do what He commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. Zephaniah 2, verse 3. This verse holds out the possibility of mercy for those who humble themselves and seek God's ways. Zephaniah's call to repentance reflects God's desire for His people to turn back to Him before it's too late. Although the day of judgment is coming, God remains willing to save those who return to Him in humility and righteousness. After the intense descriptions of judgment, the tone shifts in Zephaniah 3, where the prophet speaks of a future time of restoration. God promises to purify the lips of the people, to remove their shame, and to gather the faithful remnant who have trusted in him. In this future, Israel will live in safety, free from fear and oppression. One of the most beautiful images of God's love comes in Zephaniah's description of God rejoicing over his people. He will quiet you with his love. He will rejoice over you with singing. Zephaniah 3:17. This passage reveals the depth of God's love for his people and the joy he takes in their restoration. After the storm of judgment, the faithful will experience a new dawn, filled with God's presence, peace, and joy. The Book of Haggai. A prophet stands before a half-built temple, calling the people to finish the work, reminding them that God's presence among them is worth every effort. As they rebuild, God promises that the glory to come will be greater than they could ever imagine. After the promise of restoration in Zephaniah, the people of Israel return from exile to their homeland. But the land they return to is in ruins, and the temple, the center of their worship, remains half-built and neglected. Into this situation steps the prophet Haggai, urging the people to prioritize the rebuilding of the temple. His message is clear. Rebuilding the temple is not just about a physical structure, but about restoring God's presence and blessing among his people. The book of Haggai focuses on a critical moment in Israel's history, the rebuilding of the temple after the return from exile. The people have returned to the land, but the temple, which had been destroyed during the Babylonian conquest, remains in ruins. While the people focus on rebuilding their homes and lives, they have neglected the house of the Lord. Haggai's task is to stir the people into action, reminding them that God's presence among them is tied to the temple, and until it is restored, they will not experience the fullness of his blessing. Haggai's message is both a call to obedience and an assurance of God's promise. He encourages the people by reminding them that God's Spirit is with them and that the glory of the new temple will surpass that of the former. Though the people face challenges and discouragement, Haggai's words inspire them to finish the work, promising that their obedience will lead to blessing and prosperity. Haggai's first message to the people is a call to action. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much but harvested little. You eat but never have enough. You drink but never have your fill. My house remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. Haggai 1:5-9. The people have focused on their own needs, but neglecting the temple has left them spiritually and materially unsatisfied. Haggai urges them to rebuild the temple, not just for the sake of the building, but because it represents the presence of God among them. By restoring the temple, the people are showing their commitment to God, and in return, God promises to bless their efforts. In response to Haggai's message, the people begin the work of rebuilding the temple. To encourage them, Haggai delivers a powerful word of assurance. I am with you, declares the Lord. Haggai 1:13. God's presence is with them as they labor, and their obedience will lead to his blessing. Despite the people's initial enthusiasm, they face discouragement as they realize that the new temple does not seem as glorious as the Temple of Solomon. But Haggai delivers a surprising promise. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, and in this place I will grant peace. Haggai 2:9. Though the new temple may appear less impressive, its spiritual significance will be even greater, and God's presence will fill it with glory. Haggai's prophecy about the future glory of the temple is not just about the physical structure, but points to a greater fulfillment. The glory of the temple will be realized through the coming of the Messiah, who will embody the presence of God among his people. In this way, Haggai's message foreshadows the coming of Jesus Christ, who referred to himself as the true temple, the place where God and humanity meet. By calling the people to rebuild the temple, Haggai is calling them to participate in God's larger plan of redemption and restoration. The work they are doing has eternal significance, and God promises to bless them as they remain faithful to His call. Zephaniah and Haggai both emphasize the importance of God's presence among His people. Zephaniah warns of the coming day of the Lord, a time of judgment for the wicked, but also a time of restoration for the faithful. His message reminds us that God's justice is real, but so is His mercy for those who turn to Him. Haggai, on the other hand, focuses on the rebuilding of the temple, urging the people to prioritize God's house and reminding them of the blessings that come from obedience. Both books point to a future where God's presence will be fully realized among His people, offering hope and encouragement in the midst of trials. Together, these prophets teach us that God's presence is both a comfort and a challenge, calling us to trust in His promises and to faithfully participate in His work, knowing that His glory will ultimately shine brighter than we can imagine. The Book of Zechariah. In a night filled with strange visions, a prophet sees the future unfolding, a king riding on a donkey, and a city where God will reign forever. Zechariah's prophecy encourages the exiles to keep building, for their efforts are part of God's grand design to restore and renew the world. While Haggai called the exiles to rebuild the temple and reminded them of God's presence and blessing, the prophet Zechariah offers a broader and more visionary perspective. His message is not only about the immediate task of rebuilding, but also about the future glory that awaits God's people. Through a series of symbolic visions, Zechariah reveals that God is at work, not just in the present, but in the unfolding of His eternal plan, one that includes the coming of a Messiah and the establishment of God's kingdom. The book of Zechariah is filled with a series of strange and symbolic visions, each delivering a message of encouragement and hope to the people of Israel as they rebuild their shattered lives and their temple. These visions reassure the exiles that God is with them and that their efforts to rebuild the temple are part of a much larger divine plan. Zechariah's prophecy points to both the immediate future, the restoration of Jerusalem, and the distant future, when God will send a king, the Messiah, to establish His reign over the entire world. Zechariah's visions are often complex and mysterious, involving horses, lampstands, flying scrolls, and olive trees. Yet they all convey a consistent message. God is actively working to restore His people, purify their worship, and bring about the coming kingdom where peace and righteousness will prevail. One of the most significant prophecies in the book is the announcement of a king who will come riding on a donkey, a direct reference to the coming of Jesus Christ, the humble and righteous king. Zechariah receives a series of night visions, each filled with symbolism. In one vision, 4 horsemen patrol the earth, representing God's watchful eye over the nations. In another, a golden lampstand is fed by 2 olive trees, symbolizing the presence of God's Spirit and the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest, who are responsible for the rebuilding of the temple. These visions serve as reminders that God's power and Spirit are at work behind the scenes, even when the people face opposition and hardship. One particularly striking vision involves a flying scroll, representing God's word going out to cleanse the land of sin and bring judgment on those who act unjustly. One of the most significant moments in Zechariah's prophecy comes in Zechariah 9:9, where he foretells the arrival of a king who will come to Jerusalem riding on a donkey. "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." This prophecy is later fulfilled when Jesus enters Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, marking him as the promised Messiah. Zechariah's vision of the Messiah points to a future king who will bring peace and salvation to the nations. Unlike earthly kings who rule with force, this king will come in humility, bringing righteousness and justice. Zechariah's words not only encouraged the exiles, but also pointed forward to the arrival of the true king, Jesus Christ. The final chapters of Zechariah look beyond the rebuilding of the temple to the future reign of God over the earth. Zechariah envisions a time when God's kingdom will be established, and he will dwell among his people forever. In this future city, Jerusalem will be a place of peace and prosperity, and all nations will come to worship the Lord. Zechariah's prophecy offers hope not just for Israel, but for the entire world. He speaks of a day when God's justice will be fully realized and his presence will fill the earth. This vision of the future reign of God gives the people a glimpse of the glory to come, reminding them that their current work of rebuilding is part of a larger, eternal plan. Malachi, the final warning. In Malachi, a final prophet stands before a waiting people, warning them to turn back to God, but also promising that soon a messenger will come to prepare the way for the Lord himself. Malachi's words close the Old Testament, leaving the people with a sense of expectation and hope. As the Old Testament draws to a close, the book of Malachi stands as a final warning and a last call to Israel. The temple has been rebuilt, but the spiritual state of the people has once again declined. The promises of the earlier prophets have not yet been fully realized, and Malachi calls the people to renew their faithfulness to God. He condemns their unfaithfulness and hypocrisy, but he also looks forward to the coming of a messenger who will prepare the way for the Lord. The book of Malachi is a series of disputes between God and the people of Israel. The people have become complacent and unfaithful, offering blemished sacrifices, neglecting the tithe, and doubting God's love for them. Through the prophet Malachi, God confronts the people with their sins, but he also offers a promise. A messenger will come to prepare the way for the Lord, and the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings. Malachi 4:2. Malachi's message is both a warning and a promise. He warns that if the people do not repent, they will face judgment. But for those who fear the Lord, a time of restoration and blessing is coming. Malachi's prophecy looks forward to the arrival of John the Baptist, the messenger who would prepare the way for Jesus Christ. His words serve as a bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament, pointing to the coming Messiah who will fulfill God's plan of redemption. Malachi opens with God's indictment of the people for their unfaithfulness. The priests are offering blemished sacrifices, showing a lack of respect for God's holiness. The people are withholding the tithe, robbing God of what is rightfully his. And many are questioning God's justice, asking, "Where is the God of justice?" Malachi 2:17. Malachi calls the people to repent and return to a genuine, faithful relationship with God. He warns them that their lack of reverence will lead to judgment, but he also holds out the promise of blessing for those who honor God with their worship and their lives. One of the most significant prophecies in Malachi is the announcement of a messenger who will come to prepare the way for the Lord. In Malachi 3:1, God says, "I will send my messenger, who will prepare the way before me." Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant, whom you desire, will come. This prophecy points directly to John the Baptist, who would later prepare the way for Jesus Christ. Malachi's message of preparation is a reminder that God's promises are still unfolding. The people must remain faithful and watchful, for the time is coming when God's Messiah will arrive. Malachi ends with a vision of the day of the Lord, a time of both judgment and healing. For the wicked, the day will be a time of destruction, but for those who fear the Lord, it will be a day of great joy and restoration. For you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings. Malachi 4:2. This image of the Son of Righteousness brings hope to the faithful, promising healing, light, and blessing. The final verses of Malachi also speak of the coming of Elijah, who will turn the hearts of the people back to God. This points forward to the ministry of John the Baptist, who comes in the spirit of Elijah to prepare the way for the Messiah. Zechariah and Malachi close the Old Testament with a powerful vision of the future. Zechariah's visions offer hope and encouragement to the exiles, reminding them that God's plan is still unfolding and that a king will come to establish God's eternal reign. Malachi, on the other hand, serves as a final warning to the people of Israel, calling them to faithfulness and promising the arrival of a messenger who will prepare the way for the Lord. Both prophets remind us that God's promises are sure and that judgment and restoration are part of His unfolding plan. As the Old Testament closes, the people of Israel are left waiting, watching for the arrival of the Messiah, the one who will bring God's plan of redemption to its fulfillment. Thank you for watching. God bless you. Amen.